Oh, a stranger seeking shelter from the night. Welcome. It's been a long day out among the outer rim, so why not rest here a while? The desert wind is cold after dark, but don't worry. I have some tales that may soothe your mind as you regain your strength. Are you all set? Good. Tonight, let me tell you of the greatest struggle the galaxy has ever known. A war of shadows and starfire, of tyranny and hope, waged between a crumbling empire and a scattered band of rebels who refused to kneel. From the first whispered acts of defiance to a final stand upon the burning sands of Jakku, this is the complete story of the Galactic Civil War. So settle in and let the long tale carry you gently into rest. In the year 19 years before the Battle of Yavin, the galaxy stood at the end of a long and terrible conflict known as the Clone Wars. For 3 years, the armies of the Galactic Republic had fought the droid legions of the Confederacy of Independent Systems across countless worlds, and the fighting had left the galaxy weary, scarred, and desperate for peace. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine had guided the Republic through this war from his seat on the world of Coruscant, gathering more and more authority into his hands with each passing crisis. The Senate, once a body that debated and voted and balanced the will of thousands of systems, had slowly surrendered its powers to a single man. And when the war finally reached its end, Palpatine did not step down. Instead, he stood before the assembled senators and delivered a speech that would echo through the ages. Palpatine claimed that the Jedi Order, the ancient guardians of peace who had served the Republic for 1,000 generations, had attempted to assassinate him and seize control of the government. He named them traitors. He declared that the Republic would be reorganized into the First Galactic Empire, a strong and lasting state that would guarantee security and stability for all its citizens. He named himself Galactic Emperor, and he would rule for life. The senators rose to their feet and applauded, thousands of voices cheering the birth of a new order. The Palpatine had not seized power through a sudden coup or a violent revolution. He had accumulated it slowly, patiently, through years of manipulation, as one crisis after another convinced the galaxy to hand him just a little more control. By the time anyone understood what had happened, the Republic was already gone. What the cheering senators did not know was that Palpatine was a Sith Lord, a master of the dark side of the Force, and that he had orchestrated the entire war from both sides. He had been the secret enemy the Republic fought against, and the trusted leader they turned to for protection all at once. His true name was Darth Sidious, and the destruction of the Jedi had been his goal for decades. When the moment came, he issued a command known as Order 66, and across the galaxy, the clone soldiers who had fought alongside the Jedi turned their weapons on their generals. Jedi Knights and Masters who had survived years of war were struck down by the very troops they had led. Temples burned, younglings perished. In a matter of hours, an order that had endured for millennia was reduced to a scattered handful of survivors hiding in the farthest corners of the galaxy. The years that followed came to be called the Dark Times. The surviving Jedi were hunted relentlessly by the Emperor's agents, dark side warriors known as the Inquisitors, who scoured the worlds of the galaxy searching for anyone who could touch the Force. Those Jedi who remained went into deep hiding, burying their lightsabers, abandoning their names, and living as ordinary beings in the hope of escaping notice. To stand beside the Emperor was a towering figure clad entirely in black armor, his breathing amplified into a slow mechanical rhythm that filled every room he entered. This was Darth Vader, the Emperor's enforcer and apprentice, a being of tremendous power in the dark side, who carried out his master's will without mercy. Where Vader walked, resistance ended. Under the new empire, the galaxy changed. Imperial forces moved from system to system, stripping worlds of their resources, conscripting their populations, and leaving ruin where thriving communities had once stood. Entire planets were drained of ore, timber, and fuel to feed the Empire's growing war machine. Fear became the tool by which order was maintained, and the sight of white-armored stormtroopers marching through a city street was enough to silence most who might have spoken against the regime. The Senate still met on Coruscant, but its voice grew fainter with each passing year, a hollow shell kept in place to give the illusion that the old ways had not entirely vanished. Yet even in these darkest of years, not every heart submitted. In quiet corners, across the vast reaches of space, there were beings who remembered the Republic that had come before, who mourned the fallen Jedi, and who refused to accept that tyranny was the natural order of things. Their anger was small and scattered at first, whispered in cantinas and coded transmissions, carried between worlds by those brave enough to speak. These first embers of defiance would take years to catch. They would be fanned by cruelty, fed by loss, and slowly gathered together by those willing to risk everything. And from those embers, in time, would rise the flame of open rebellion. To understand how that flame first began to burn, we must look to the scattered fighters who took up the struggle long before any alliance was ever formed. During the Clone Wars, Jedi generals and Republic operatives traveled to distant worlds controlled by the Confederacy of Independent Systems. They carried heavy wooden crates filled with DC-15 blaster rifles, thermal detonators, and long-range comlinks. They cracked these crates open in damp caves, crowded basements, and thick jungle clearings, handing the weapons to local fighters. These local men and women wore civilian clothing made of rough-spun wool and synthetic leather, wrapping their faces in scarves to block the dust and ash. They learned to fire the Republic blasters, carefully aligning the metallic sights and pulling the triggers to send red plasma bolts into the armored chassis of separatist battle droids. Furthermore, they rigged explosive charges to the legs of towering droid walkers and watched the machines collapse into the mud. For 3 years, these local militias relied on the Republic to supply them with ammunition, medical packs, and tactical data. They hid in the shadows of the rocks and the trees, striking at the droid factories and the separatist supply lines. Consequently, a vast network of guerrilla fighters learned the exact physical methods required to destabilize an occupying army. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine transformed the Republic into the Galactic Empire and ordered the destruction of the Jedi Order. The clone troopers who had delivered the weapons to the local militias painted over the colorful markings on their armor, covering the bright blues and reds with stark, uniform white. Imperial officers arrived on the liberated worlds in crisp gray tunics and black leather boots. They stripped the Republic crests from the government buildings and bolted the heavy hexagonal cogs of the Galactic Empire in their place. Meanwhile, the local fighters watched these new forces roll tanks through their city streets and set up blockades at the spaceports. The stormtroopers leveled their E-11 blaster rifles at the citizens, shoving merchants against the brickwork and dragging dissidents into armored transport shuttles. The militias took the very blasters and thermal detonators the Jedi had given them and wrapped them in heavy oilcloth. They buried the weapons under the stone floorboards of their homes or hid them deep inside the hollow trunks of ancient trees. When the Imperial officers seized control of the local food supplies and drained the raw coaxium from the mining facilities, the local fighters dug up their weapons. They loaded the power packs into the DC-15 rifles, checked the sights, and marched back into the caves. They aimed the Republic-issued weapons at the white-armored stormtroopers patrolling the perimeters of the Imperial garrisons. Saw Gerrera stood at the center of these early conflicts. Gerrera had fought on the jungle world of Onderon during the Clone Wars, kneeling in the thick brush and firing rocket launchers into the hulls of separatist gunships. Under the newly formed Empire, Gerrera operated out of makeshift camps built inside rocky canyons and hollowed-out ruins. He wore a bulky pressurized suit, equipped with life support tubes that snaked around his neck and connected to a heavy chest plate. He breathed with a loud, mechanical rasp, his lungs heavily scarred from years of inhaling toxic smoke and chemical dust. He walked with a pronounced limp, leaning heavily on a metal cane while holding a heavy blaster pistol in his opposite hand. Gerrera gathered fighters around him, outfitting them in mismatched armor, salvaged from destroyed Imperial scout troopers and downed starfighters. His partisans set highly volatile explosives along the durasteel tracks of Imperial hovertrains, completely derailing the transports and sending crates of Imperial munitions spilling into the ravines below. Gerrera stood before recording devices and broadcasted audio messages across encrypted holonet frequencies. He leaned into the microphones, his eyes wide, and stated that these small, scattered groups of armed fighters were the only physical barrier standing between Palpatine and total control of the galaxy. He ordered his listeners to gather their weapons, stockpile their fuel, and prepare for a galactic civil war. Gerrera's partisans fought their battles entirely isolated from the rest of the galaxy. Across countless other star systems, similar groups of insurgents ambushed Imperial patrols and raided supply depots. On desert planets, scavengers pried the armor, plating off derelict freighters, and welded the scrap metal to their civilian speeders. They intercepted Imperial patrols in the Dune Seas, firing modified hunting rifles through the viewports of the transport vehicles. On orbital gas mining stations, mechanics sliced into the Imperial command consoles, typing rapidly on the physical keyboards to bypass the security grids. They downloaded encrypted troop movements onto portable data drives and smuggled the drives in the false bottoms of their toolboxes. Furthermore, on densely populated city worlds, individuals dropped small metal cylinders filled with coaxium into hidden compartments behind alleyway trash receptacles. A courier would later retrieve the cylinder in the dead of night, slipping away into the shadows. These groups operated in complete silence, separated by millions of light-years of cold space. When an Imperial garrison discovered a rebel cell, AT-ST walkers marched into the hidden encampments and fired heavy laser cannons into the tents. The insurgents fell in the dirt, their weapons melting in the resulting fires. The surviving cells on other planets stared at the static on their holoscreens, completely blind to the smoke rising from the destroyed camps. They fought and died under the shadow of triangular star destroyers, operating entirely on their own with scavenged weapons and localized tactics. To survive the vast numbers of the Imperial army and coordinate their strikes, these isolated insurgents needed to establish physical lines of communication. They needed to link their encrypted frequencies and share their stolen munitions, leading them directly to the hidden rooms and shadowed corridors where the foundation of an alliance would finally take shape. Bail Organa and Mon Mothma sat across from each other in a sealed, sound-dampened chamber deep within the Coruscant senatorial complex. Bail wore the high-collared, woven blue tunics of Alderaan, and he rested his hands on the smooth metallic surface of the table. Mon Mothma wore heavy white Chandrilan silk, and she maintained a perfectly straight posture as she slid a small, rectangular data cylinder across the table. In the massive public assembly halls, they stood in floating repulsor pods and listened to the decrees of the imperial commanders, while watching the red-robed guards stand perfectly still beside the chancellor's podium. Behind the heavy durasteel doors of their private quarters, they organized the physical transfer of weapons, fuel, and medical supplies to the scattered fighters in the outer rim. They typed access codes into encrypted terminals, routing billions of credits from their planetary treasuries into hidden accounts. Luthen Rail managed the physical distribution of these funds, operating a high-end antiquities gallery in the upper levels of Coruscant. He surrounded himself with carved stone statues, ancient armor pieces, and polished jewels resting on illuminated glass pedestals. He wore fine velvet jackets and smiled at the wealthy imperial officers who walked through his showroom, offering them snifters of blue wine. In the back rooms of his gallery, hidden behind the public walkways, Luthen packed heavy metal lockboxes with secured credit ingots, and he handed these boxes to couriers, smugglers, and mercenaries who waited in the alleyways. Luthen changed out of his velvet jackets, pulling on rough, synthetic fabric cloaks, and boarded his modified Fondor Hallcraft. He gripped the control yoke and steered his ship through hyperspace, landing on muddy airstrips and frozen glacial plateaus. He stepped down his boarding ramp into the driving rain, carrying crates of repeating blasters and thermal detonators. He met with the leaders of the isolated insurgent cells, handing them the encrypted comlinks and the credit lockboxes, and he gave them the exact frequency codes required to speak with one another securely across the vast expanses of the galaxy. 4 years before the Battle of Yavin, these physical connections resulted in coordinated military actions as fighters from different planets aligned their strikes. Rebel pilots sitting in the cockpits of mismatched Y-wing bombers pulled their flight yokes simultaneously, dropping proton munitions onto the exposed hulls of Imperial dry docks. Mechanics on different worlds synchronized their slicing programs, shutting down the power grids of Imperial detention centers at the exact same moment. The disparate cells merged their supply lines, sharing the blasters and the explosives they had scavenged. Groups of humans, Twi'leks, and Wookiees gathered in hidden cavern bases, pooling their stolen rations and their medical packs. They painted the matching red crest of the Alliance on the sides of their starfighters, marking their ships with a unified symbol, and they stole crates of coaxium fuel from Imperial refineries to load the heavy canisters onto their freighters, ensuring their newly formed fleet possessed the fuel required to jump to hyperspace. They loaded their combined munitions onto heavy cargo freighters and established the Alliance to restore the Republic, physically linking their computer networks to share hyperspace routes and Imperial patrol schedules on their glowing monitors. 2 years later, Mon Mothma fled the capital and stood inside the cramped, dimly lit cargo hold of a moving rebel ship. She gripped a tall metal microphone stand with both hands, and she leaned toward the recording sensor, her voice echoing off the corrugated durasteel walls of the hold as the ship's hyperdrive hummed loudly beneath the floorboards. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the metal datapad, feeling the continuous vibrations of the ship's engines. She wore a simple gray tunic, trading the heavy silks and the jeweled necklaces of her former senatorial life for standard-issue flight gear. She looked directly into the blinking red light of the holocamera, keeping her eyes completely focused on the lens, and she read from the physical datapad to record her declaration of the Rebel Alliance. She spoke of the destroyed cities, the stolen resources, and the heavily armed stormtroopers occupying their homes. She formally called upon the citizens of the galaxy to pick up their weapons and fight the Imperial forces. Technicians sitting at the communications console pushed the transmission sliders upward, sending her voice out across the encrypted HoloNet channels. The signal bounced off deep space relay towers, passing through asteroid fields and planetary atmospheres, and reached the hidden camps on the jungle moons and the desert wastes. The local fighters gathered around their portable radios, listening to the static-laced audio of her speech, and tightened their grips on their Republic-issued blasters. The Imperial commanders sitting in the bridge pits of their star destroyers tracked the massive spike in Rebel communications. They read the scrolling data screens and identified the precise locations where the civilian populations supported these fighters. The officers spoke into their comm channels, ordering their fleet admirals to tighten their blockades and deploy their heavy cruisers to the most vocal systems. They targeted the heavily populated worlds to draw the newly formed alliance out of the shadows. The commanders directed their massive warships toward the planet Gorman, a world of dense urban centers and wide stone plazas. Thousands of civilian workers gathered in the city squares, holding up physical banners and locking their arms together. They formed a solid wall of bodies across the landing pads, standing directly in the path of the descending Imperial transport vessels dropping from the sky above them. The heavy Imperial cargo cruisers lowered their landing gear as they dropped through the atmosphere. Thick Durasteel footpads extended outward from the massive grey hulls. The crowd of civilian workers standing on the Gorman Plaza linked their arms tighter, bracing their boots against the polished stone. Up in the command bridges of the descending cruisers, the Imperial captains pushed their throttle levers forward and locked them into place. The ships maintained their descent velocity, their immense repulsor lift engines flaring with blue plasma that scorched the stone and ignited the physical banners held by the front row of protesters. The heavy metal hulls pressed directly into the mass of bodies. The deafening roar of the repulsor engines vibrated through the stone plaza, shaking the surrounding buildings and drowning out the sound of breaking bones and tearing fabric as the transports settled their full millions of tons onto the plaza floor. Cassian Andor lay flat against the edge of a deep drainage trench on the perimeter of the landing pad. He tasted copper blood on his tongue and inhaled the thick, choking smoke of burned synthetic clothing and searing ozone. He pushed heavy slabs of cracked permacrete off his legs and dragged himself through the grey ash covering the ground. He looked back at the landing zone, seeing the Imperial transports resting completely stationary on the plaza, their loading ramps lowering over the flattened remains of thousands of workers. Stormtroopers marched down the ramps in perfect unison, their white boots stepping onto the scorched debris, their E-11 blasters raised to secure the perimeter per their physical orders. Cassian pulled his rough canvas hood over his head, wiping a thick mixture of soot and blood from his cheek with the back of his sleeve, and walked away from the plaza into the narrow, shadowed alleyways of the lower city. He climbed into the cargo hold of a smuggling skiff hours later, gripping the metal bulkheads as the ship broke orbit and jumped into hyperspace. Someone in the crowd had held up a portable recording device before the ships touched the ground. The raw, unedited holo footage transmitted across encrypted channels to thousands of star systems through hidden relay satellites. Sentient beings sitting in dimly lit cantinas, crowded repair bays, and quiet agricultural homesteads watched the blue-tinted holograms project the exact moment the ships crushed the protesters. They looked at the flickering images of the Imperial transports settling onto the crowd, illuminating their faces in the dark rooms. Citizens stood up from their tables, walked to their storage crates, unlocked the heavy metal latches, and pulled out hidden blaster pistols and rusted vibroblades. Factory workers on Corellia dropped their heavy hydrospanners onto the Durasteel grates and boarded passenger shuttles, heading for the outer rim. University students on Chandrilla packed rough canvas duffel bags with medical supplies, ration bars, and survival gear, handing their physical credit chips to smugglers in exchange for covert passage off-world. The senatorial aides who had previously drafted data petitions of grievance deleted their text files and smashed their datapads with heavy iron tools. They stripped off their formal silk robes, put on reinforced leather flight jackets, and loaded heavy crates of ammunition onto unmarked cargo haulers. The rebel cell leaders waiting in the scattered camps watched their numbers multiply day by day. Dozens of new recruits walked down the landing ramps of incoming smuggler ships, carrying heavy rucksacks and stolen Imperial munitions on their shoulders. The recruits stood in muddy clearings and rocky canyons, gripping their blaster rifles and firing red plasma bolts into metal targets until the barrels of their weapons glowed orange with intense heat. Mechanics welded heavy armor plating onto civilian freighters and bolted laser cannons to the wings of agricultural crop dusters, turning every available machine into a weapon of war. The physical influx of fighters, ships, and heavy artillery quickly outgrew the small, hidden caverns and temporary canyon outposts. The alliance required a centralized command structure and a massive staging ground capable of housing squadrons of heavy bombers, specialized starfighters, and thousands of armed troops. Rebel commanders unrolled physical star maps across illuminated metal tables, dragging their fingers across the glowing blue lines of the hyperspace lanes to locate a specific, isolated system far from the core worlds. They directed their newly expanded fleet toward a massive red gas giant encircled by a dense, humid moon, plotting their navigation vectors for a hidden world dominated by towering ancient stone pyramids surrounded by thick, impenetrable canopy forest. The moon of Yavin 4 orbited a massive red gas giant, covered entirely in thick green canopy and twisting vines. Heavy moisture hung in the air, coating the ancient stone pyramids that broke through the treetops. The Masasi people had built these stepped ziggurats out of massive, rough-hewn stone blocks thousands of years prior. Rebel technicians cleared the dense vegetation from the entryways and installed heavy durasteel blast doors into the stone frames. Inside the great temple, mechanics routed thick power cables along the carved rock walls and suspended bright lumen strips from the vaulted ceilings. The air inside smelled of damp earth, refined coaxium fuel, and the ozone discharge of welding torches. X-wing and Y-wing starfighters sat parked in long rows across the ground floor of the temple. Astromech droids rolled across the stone tiles, and pilots in orange flight suits climbed metal ladders to inspect their engines. This facility housed the largest concentration of rebel forces in the galaxy. General Jan Dodonna walked through the hangar bay, holding a physical datapad and assigning rotation schedules to the technicians. Cargo haulers landed on the cleared dirt strips outside the temple, lowering their ramps to unload crates of blaster gas and sealed ration packs. The local wildlife, consisting of large winged birds and loudly chirping insects, vocalized continuously in the surrounding jungle canopy. Rebel sentries stood watch at the perimeter of the clearing, holding long blaster rifles and scanning the thick foliage for any signs of Imperial scout patrols. Meanwhile, a group of Corellian corvettes, A-wing interceptors, and modified freighters broke through the planet's atmosphere and landed in the jungle clearing. This was Phoenix Squadron, a collection of pilots and soldiers who had fought the Imperial forces across the Lothal sector. Commander Jun Sato stepped down from his command ship and walked into the Great Temple. He met with Mon Mothma and Bail Organa at a large circular holotable in the center of the command center. They synchronized their navigation computers and merged their supply inventories. The technicians linked the communication arrays of the newly arrived ships directly to the Yavin 4 central mainframe. Consequently, the arrival of Phoenix Squadron physically combined the scattered regional cells into a single, unified military force operating directly out of the stone temples. Furthermore, the rebel soldiers stationed at the base established physical defensive perimeters around the pyramids. They dragged heavy laser cannons to the top tiers of the stone temples and aimed the barrels at the sky. Technicians installed sensor arrays in the upper tree canopy to scan the orbital pathways for Imperial Star Destroyers. The soldiers slept on simple cots arranged in the lower levels of the temple, eating their rations from metal tins in the communal mess halls. They studied physical star charts and cleaned their blasters, preparing for the inevitable physical confrontation with the Imperial Army. The Leadership Council held continuous meetings in the war room, reviewing physical troop movements and analyzing intercepted Imperial transmission logs. In a dimly lit storage bay on the lower levels of Coruscant, a rebel operative named Clea Markey met with Cassian Andor. Clea wore a dark, heavy cloak over a simple tunic. She walked past rusted cargo containers and dripping coolant pipes to reach the rendezvous point. The air in the storage bay smelled of rust and stale water leaking from the overhead lines. She unlocked a metal lockbox and handed Cassian a physical data cylinder. Clea looked directly at Cassian and spoke in a low, measured voice. She detailed the physical shipment of massive kyber crystals and heavy dunium plating moving across Imperial supply lines. She explained that the Imperial engineers were building a spherical battle station in deep space. She described the physical dimensions of the station, stating it was the size of a small moon and housed a main reactor capable of powering a laser dish wide enough to shatter a planetary crust. Cassian took the cylinder, gripped it tightly in his hand, and placed it into the inner pocket of his flight jacket. Cassian boarded his U-wing starfighter, gripped the physical flight yoke, and flew the data directly to the Great Temple on Yavin 4. He walked into the briefing room and plugged the cylinder into the central holotable. The blue light of the projector illuminated the faces of the rebel leaders standing around the perimeter. Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and General Dodonna stared at the flickering wireframe schematic of the massive spherical structure. The physical scale of the weapon forced the assembled leaders to formulate an immediate plan of attack. The rebel senators debated the logistics of launching a fleet against such a massive facility. They pointed to the heavily fortified Imperial security complexes marked on their physical maps. The Alliance needed the complete structural blueprints of the station to locate a physical vulnerability in the armor plating. The rebel generals tracked the origin of the station's data files to a highly secure Imperial archive facility on a remote tropical planet. The leaders required a specialized infiltration team to physically enter the vault, bypass the security grid, and extract the physical data tapes from the Imperial databanks. High above the rocky surface of Geonosis, millions of Imperial engineers and construction droids worked along the exterior trenches of a massive spherical space station. The structure spanned 160 kilometers in diameter, covered entirely in interlocking grey durasteel plates and protruding sensor towers. Deep within the equatorial trench, technicians in black uniforms monitored the heavy power cables connecting the central hypermatter reactor to a large concave dish on the station's upper hemisphere. They pushed physical levers and typed command sequences on their illuminated consoles, directing raw kyber crystal energy into the firing arrays. The station housed thousands of turbo laser batteries, tractor beam projectors, and hangar bays filled with TIE fighters. When the Imperial gunners aligned the targeting computers and pressed the firing studs, 8 focused beams of green plasma converged inside the focal dish, creating a single, massive laser blast capable of instantly shattering the crust and mantle of an entire terrestrial planet. Back on the jungle moon of Yavin 4, a young woman named Jin Erso stood in the center of the Rebel Command Center. She wore a dark gray flight vest over a worn civilian tunic, her hands resting on the edge of the circular holotable. Beside her stood Cassian Andor, wearing a heavy brown field jacket and holding his customized blaster pistol at his hip. Jin looked directly at the assembled rebel senators and generals, speaking clearly over the low hum of the base's power generators. She described her physical journey to the rain-soaked world of Eadu, where she watched her father, a captured Imperial scientist, die on an observation platform. She stated that her father had intentionally placed a structural flaw deep inside the battle station's main reactor. Furthermore, she pointed to the glowing blue projection on the holotable, demanding that the Alliance send their fleet to the tropical planet of Scarif to extract the physical data tapes containing the station's complete blueprints. Meanwhile, Mon Mothma and Bail Organa listened from the edge of the table, their faces illuminated by the blue light of the hologram. Other senators shifted in their seats, crossing their arms and speaking loudly over one another. A male senator from the Pamarthan sector slammed his fist onto the metal table, demanding the immediate surrender of the rebel forces. A female general shook her head and pointed her finger at Jin, citing the overwhelming number of Imperial Star Destroyers guarding the Scarif system. The physical arguments escalated into shouting matches, echoing off the carved stone walls of the Masasi Temple. Finally, the council members raised their hands to cast their physical votes. The majority of the hands remained flat on the surface of the holotable. Consequently, the Alliance leaders withheld their authorization for the attack, citing the limited physical resources of their fleet and the immense tactical risk of engaging the Imperial forces directly. The Council ordered the squadrons to remain grounded on the jungle moon. Subsequently, Jin and Cassian turned away from the holotable and walked down the stone corridors of the Great Temple. They entered the main hangar bay, surrounded by the smell of burning engine fuel and the loud grinding of hydrospanners against metal plating. Cassian stopped next to a stolen Imperial cargo shuttle, resting on its heavy hydraulic landing gear. He looked at the group of rebel soldiers, mechanics, and former Imperial pilots gathering around the loading ramp. These individuals wore mismatched camouflage fatigues, heavy combat helmets, and thick bandoliers loaded with explosive charges. They carried heavy repeating blasters and long-barreled sniper rifles. Cassian spoke to the assembled volunteers, stating that they would fly to Scarif and extract the data tapes themselves. The soldiers nodded in agreement, checking their weapon sights and loading power packs into their blasters. Jin stepped onto the metal ramp, looking at the dozens of individuals boarding the Imperial shuttle. When asked for their call sign by the control tower dispatcher, the pilot gripped the communication microphone and designated their unsanctioned group as Rogue One. Accordingly, the pilot pushed the throttle levers forward, and the 4 main engines of the Imperial shuttle ignited with a deep, vibrating roar. The heavy ship lifted off the dirt landing pad, blowing loose leaves and thick mud across the perimeter of the jungle base. The shuttle angled its nose toward the sky and broke through the dense upper canopy of the towering trees. Rogue One left the atmosphere of Yavin 4 and entered the dark vacuum of space, aligning its navigation computers with the coordinates for the Scarif system. The pilot pulled the hyperdrive lever, stretching the distant stars into long lines of white light as the ship accelerated beyond the speed of light. Inside the cramped cargo hold, the rebel volunteers sat quietly on metal benches lining the bulkheads. They strapped themselves into their crash webbing and held their blaster rifles tightly against their chests. They listened to the rhythmic hum of the hyperdrive engines vibrating through the floor panels. Their flight trajectory carried them directly toward the heavily fortified Imperial data vault, setting them on a collision course with an entire garrison of shore troopers, mechanized walkers, and the towering planetary shield gate protecting the warm, shallow oceans of Scarif. The planet Scarif appeared as a bright blue and green sphere covered in shallow oceans and dense island chains. A massive physical space station, known as the Shield Gate, hung in synchronous orbit directly above the primary landmass. A hexagonal deflector shield extended outward from the metal ring of the station, wrapping entirely around the planet's atmosphere and preventing any physical objects or unencrypted transmission signals from passing through. The rogue rebel shuttle approached the metal ring, transmitting stolen Imperial clearance codes to the station's control towers. The thick metal blast doors of the shield gate slid apart, and the shuttle descended through the opening into the warm atmosphere of the planet below. Cassian Andor steered the ship toward a cluster of small islands connected by transit tubes and concrete landing pads. A towering central spire, housing the secure Imperial databanks, stood at the center of the complex. Cassian landed the shuttle on one of the outer durasteel pads. He unstrapped his heavy blaster rifle and ordered the rebel volunteers to remain hidden in the cargo hold. Jin and Cassian walked down the boarding ramp, disguised in standard Imperial military uniforms, carrying metal code cylinders and data slabs. They bypassed the perimeter guards and entered the lower levels of the central spire. Inside the databank tower, hundreds of illuminated physical data tapes spun inside tall, glass-fronted server racks. Cassian grabbed an Imperial technician by the collar, shoving him against a metal control console, and forced him to type the override commands into the physical keyboard. Meanwhile, outside the tower, the remaining rebel soldiers charged down the shuttle ramp and fired explosive charges at the nearby landing platforms. The loud detonations tore through the concrete, sending heavy chunks of debris raining down onto the parked TI fighters. Shore troopers, wearing specialized tan armor, ran across the sandy beaches, firing their blasters at the rebel forces positioned behind heavy cargo crates. Up in the orbital space above the planet, the entire rebel fleet reverted from hyperspace directly in front of the shield gate. Mon Mothma and Bail Organa had reversed their physical orders after learning of Rogue One's departure, authorizing the deployment of the Alliance forces. X-Wing starfighters painted with red and yellow stripes dove toward the metal ring, firing proton torpedoes into the shield projectors. The Imperial commanders aboard the station scrambled their TIE fighters, sending hundreds of small, twin-engine ships swarming out of the hangar bays. Red and green plasma bolts crossed the dark vacuum of space, striking the heavy hull plating of the rebel cruisers and shattering the solar panels of the Imperial fighters. The rebel general commanding the fleet ordered a hammerhead corvette to physically ram the hull of a disabled Star Destroyer. The heavy engines pushed the massive triangular ship directly into the path of another Star Destroyer, sending both heavy cruisers crashing downward into the physical ring of the shield gate. The metal ring collapsed under the immense weight, shutting off the planetary deflector shield and opening a direct physical line of communication to the planet's surface. Down inside the databank tower, Jin climbed a narrow metal maintenance ladder toward the central alignment controls. She reached out and physically pulled the heavy data tape containing the Death Star plans from the spinning server rack. She shoved the heavy cartridge into the transmitter console and pushed the primary alignment lever forward. The massive satellite dish on the roof of the tower rotated slowly, pointing directly toward the rebel command ship hovering in the newly opened space above the atmosphere. Jin typed the transmission sequence onto the physical keyboard, sending the encrypted data files shooting up through the atmosphere. The technicians aboard the rebel command ship downloaded the incoming data, saving the precise schematics of the spherical battle station onto their physical hard drives. Suddenly, a massive shape exited hyperspace directly behind the rebel fleet. The heavy wedge-shaped hull of Darth Vader's personal star destroyer, the Devastator, blocked the primary escape vector. Vader marched into the dimly lit hangar bay of his ship and boarded his personal transport. He landed his shuttle directly inside the docking bay of the rebel command ship, igniting his crimson lightsaber. He walked down the narrow metal corridors of the rebel cruiser, cutting through the physical armor and heavy blasters of the rebel soldiers blocking his path. He swung his blade in wide horizontal arcs, severing the heavy blast doors and cutting down the troops. The surviving rebels ran toward the docking ring, carrying the physical data drives holding the extracted schematics. They shoved the drives through a narrow gap in the jamming doors, handing them directly to the crew of a smaller Corellian corvette, known as the Tantive 4. The smaller ship detached its physical docking clamps from the larger cruiser and ignited its sublight engines, blasting away from the space battle before Vader could breach the final blast door. Down on the surface of Scarif, the sky turned a blinding, unnatural green. The Imperial commanders had directed the Death Star to the system, positioning the massive battle station directly above the tropical planet. The station fired a single, low-power pulse from its primary laser dish. The green beam struck the warm ocean near the horizon, instantly vaporizing the water and tearing a massive physical crater into the planet's crust. A towering wall of displaced earth and boiling steam rushed across the surface of the planet, entirely consuming the databank tower, the landing pads, and the beaches. The physical destruction of the Imperial facility ended the battle, but the small Corellian corvette carrying the extracted data plans successfully jumped into hyperspace, carrying the only known vulnerability to the Empire's ultimate weapon. The Tantive 4 dropped out of hyperspace above the desert world of Tatooine. The small rebel corvette carried the stolen Death Star plans within its central databanks. Shortly after the ship reverted to sublight speed, the massive wedge of the Imperial Star Destroyer Devastator materialized from hyperspace directly behind it. The Star Destroyer fired its heavy turbo-laser batteries, sending thick bolts of green plasma crashing into the rear deflector shields of the smaller vessel. The physical impacts shook the entire structure of the corvette, causing the interior bulkheads to buckle and the overhead lumen strips to shatter. The main drive engine exploded, tearing a jagged hole in the aft plating and venting ignited reactor gases into the vacuum of space. The disabled corvette drifted helplessly toward the yellow atmosphere of the planet below, completely caught in the invisible grip of the Star Destroyer's tractor beam. The heavy Imperial cruiser pulled the damaged ship backward into its main hangar bay. Inside the narrow white corridors of the Tantive 4, rebel troopers took up defensive positions behind metal structural beams. They wore oversized white combat helmets and light blue shirts, pointing their long-barreled blaster rifles directly at the main entry hatch. Sparks showered from the heavy Durasteel door as Imperial cutting tools sliced through the exterior locking mechanisms. The hatch exploded inward with a deafening blast of smoke and sheared metal. Stormtroopers wearing completely white armor poured through the opening, firing their E-11 blasters at the rebel defenders. the corridor filled with thick grey smoke and the sharp smell of ionized air as the rebel soldiers fell to the deck plating. The surviving troopers threw their weapons to the floor, placing their hands on the back of their heads in surrender as the stormtroopers secured the physical perimeter. Darth Vader stepped through the destroyed hatchway, his black boots crushing the scorched metal debris. He gripped a wounded rebel officer by the throat, lifting him entirely off the floor with one hand. Vader demanded the physical location of the stolen data tapes, his deep, mechanical voice echoing through the smoke-filled corridor. When the officer denied any knowledge of the plans, Vader snapped the man's neck and tossed the body aside. He ordered his stormtroopers to physically tear the ship apart, searching every storage locker, escape pod, and computer terminal for the extracted schematics. Further down the corridor, Princess Leia Organa hid behind a section of exposed conduit piping. She wore a long white dress and carried a physical data drive containing the complete structural blueprints of the Death Star. She knelt down beside a blue and white astromech droid designated R2-D2. She inserted the data drive directly into a narrow slot on the droid's domed head. She then activated the droid's primary recording sensor, speaking a brief audio message into the microphone. She instructed the droid to locate a former Jedi Knight named Obi-Wan Kenobi, who lived in exile on the planet's surface below. She ordered R2-D2 to deliver the plans and the physical recording to him without delay. The astromech droid chirped in acknowledgement and rolled down the hallway toward the ship's escape pods, accompanied by a golden protocol droid designated C-3PO. Leia stepped out from behind the pipes, drawing a long-barreled sporting blaster from under her dress. She fired a single red bolt at the approaching stormtroopers, hitting one in the chest plate. The remaining troopers returned fire, setting their weapons to stun. A blue ring of energy struck Leia in the shoulder, instantly rendering her unconscious. The troopers carried her limp body back through the corridors, presenting her to Darth Vader. Vader stood over the unconscious princess, ordering his officers to transfer her directly to the holding cells aboard the Death Star. He instructed the commander of the Star Destroyer to interrogate her, using any physical means necessary to extract the location of the hidden rebel base. Meanwhile, R2-D2 and C-3PO entered a small, cylindrical escape pod. The astromech droid extended a metal slicing arm, pressing it into the launch control panel. The explosive bolts securing the pod to the hull detonated, blasting the small vessel away from the side of the captured corvette. The pod fired its minimal thrusters, angling its heat shields toward the yellow atmosphere of Tatooine. The two droids sat inside the cramped metal sphere as it plummeted through the sky, the intense heat of re-entry scorching the outer hull plating. The Imperial gunnery officers sitting in the targeting pits of the Star Destroyer tracked the unguided escape pod on their physical sensor screens. The chief gunner placed his hand over the firing stud, aligning the crosshairs on the small metallic object falling toward the desert. He read the life-form scanners, noting a complete absence of biological readings inside the pod. Believing the launch to be a mechanical malfunction caused by the battle damage, the officer pulled his hand away from the firing console. He instructed his crew to hold their fire, saving their physical ammunition and allowing the metal sphere to continue its descent. The escape pod crashed into the deep sand dunes of the Tatooine desert, completely detaching the physical data files of the Empire's ultimate weapon from the captured rebel ship and sending them directly to the surface of the desolate planet. The escape pod rested deep within the shifting sand dunes of the Tatooine desert. Small, hooded scavengers known as Jawas drove a massive, rust-covered tracked vehicle across the wastes, retrieving the two droids from the open desert. The Jawas transported the droids to a moisture farm, consisting of subterranean living quarters and tall metal vaporators designed to extract water from the dry air. A young farm worker named Luke Skywalker handed physical credit chits to the Jawas, purchasing the droids. Luke carried tools and solvent rags into an underground garage, scrubbing the abrasive sand from the joints of the blue astromech droid. A small metal projector on the droid's dome activated, casting a glowing blue, miniature hologram of Princess Leia Organa into the dark room. The recording played a repeating audio request for a man named Obi-Wan Kenobi to deliver the stored data to the world of Alderaan. The astromech droid rolled out of the underground garage during the night, leaving continuous track marks pressed into the loose sand. The next morning, Luke climbed into a repulsor lift land speeder and drove across the desert floor to follow the trail. He located the droid near a rocky canyon where individuals wrapped entirely in heavy cloth ambushed them, swinging heavy metal maces. An older man wearing a brown hooded robe and sporting a white beard walked out from the rocks, producing a piercing, high-pitched vocal imitation of a desert predator. The attackers turned and ran deeper into the canyon. This man, Obi-Wan Kenobi, directed Luke to drive the speeder to his small, dome-shaped dwelling constructed of dried mud. Inside the dwelling, Obi-Wan opened a heavy wooden chest and extracted a polished metallic cylinder. He handed the device to Luke. Luke pressed a small ignition button on the side of the hilt, and a bright blue beam of contained plasma extended outward with a loud, resonating plasma hum. Obi-Wan explained that the weapon belonged to Luke's father, who served as a Jedi Knight operating under the Republic before the Emperor seized control. Obi-Wan instructed Luke to travel with him to deliver the astromech droid's stored data to Alderaan. Luke pushed the lightsaber back across the table, stating he must return to the farm to complete the seasonal moisture harvest. Luke stepped outside and drove his land speeder back across the vast salt flats toward his home. He arrived to find the physical structures of the farm completely reduced to burning wreckage. Thick, black smoke billowed upward from the collapsed metal moisture vaporators. The walls of the underground courtyard bore deep, black scorch marks caused by concentrated Imperial blaster fire. He walked to the edge of the crater and looked down at the charred, smoking skeletal remains of his aunt and uncle resting on the sand. He stared at the physical destruction, turned his body around, and gripped the steering yoke of his land speeder. He drove back to Obi-Wan's dwelling, packed his physical belongings into a cloth rucksack, and told the older man he would join the journey. They traveled to Mos Eisley, a sprawling spaceport constructed of interconnected sandstone blocks and rounded roofs. Squads of Imperial stormtroopers walked through the dusty streets, holding their E-11 blaster rifles and stopping civilians at intersection checkpoints to inspect their transport vehicles. Obi-Wan and Luke walked into a crowded, dimly lit cantina. The air smelled strongly of fermented grain, spilled alcohol, and roasted meat. Alien musicians played brass horns and hollow-stringed instruments on a raised circular stage. Obi-Wan approached a booth in the corner and sat across from a human pilot named Han Solo and his co-pilot, a towering Wookiee named Chewbacca, covered entirely in thick brown fur. Han wore a black vest over a white shirt and kept a heavy blaster strapped to his thigh. Obi-Wan placed a stack of physical credit ingots onto the metal table, securing immediate transport to Alderaan. Han slid the heavy gold credits across the table into his pocket and agreed to fly the group in his personal ship. They left the cantina and walked through the winding streets to Docking Bay 94. A large, saucer-shaped freighter, known as the Millennium Falcon, sat resting on the concrete landing pad. The outer hull featured asymmetrical forward mandibles, exposed wiring conduits, and deep carbon scorch marks spanning the exterior plates. As they walked up the boarding ramp, a squad of white-armored stormtroopers ran into the docking bay, firing green plasma bolts at the ship. Han drew his blaster and fired red bolts back at the troopers, forcing the soldiers to take cover. Han ran up the ramp, hit the hydraulic closing switch, and sprinted into the starboard cockpit. He pushed the throttle levers forward, igniting the massive sublight engines at the rear of the ship. The Millennium Falcon lifted off the concrete pad, accelerating through the open roof of the docking bay and blasting straight up through the yellow atmosphere. The ship entered the cold, black vacuum of space as three massive, wedge-shaped Imperial Star Destroyers moved into position to completely block their escape path. Han pulled the heavy hyperdrive lever backward. The physical stars outside the cockpit viewport stretched into long lines of brilliant white light as the heavily modified freighter jumped to light speed, carrying the small, newly formed crew directly toward the distant, deep space coordinates of a mountainous world covered in vast green plains, towering white clouds, and deep blue lakes. The Millennium Falcon dropped out of hyperspace in the Alderaan system. Instead of the blue and green sphere of the planet, the ship's forward viewports filled with a dense, expanding cloud of grey dust and jagged, tumbling rock fragments. Han Solo pulled the heavy control yoke backward, physically banking the freighter to avoid a massive chunk of planetary crust that scraped along the outer deflector shields. The ship's navigation computer flashed a continuous series of red warning lights, indicating a complete absence of the planet's gravitational pull. Obi-Wan Kenobi stood behind the pilot's chairs, staring at the debris field through the thick transparisteel glass. He stated that the Imperial forces had completely destroyed Alderaan. The destruction of the planet had left billions of tons of shattered rock and frozen atmosphere drifting through the vacuum of space. Earlier, aboard the Death Star, Grand Moff Tarkin had stood on an elevated observation platform overlooking the station's primary firing dish. He wore a crisp, grey Imperial uniform and held his hands clasped behind his back. Princess Leia Organa stood beside him, her hands restrained by heavy metal binders. Tarkin ordered Leia to reveal the physical location of the main rebel base, threatening to test the station's super laser on her home planet of Alderaan. Leia looked at the viewing screen, seeing the blue oceans and white clouds of her homeworld. She stated that the rebel base was located on the distant planet of Dantooine, attempting to misdirect the Imperial commander. Tarkin received the information, smiled, and then instructed his gunnery officers to proceed with the firing sequence anyway, stating that Dantooine was too remote to serve as an effective demonstration of the Empire's absolute power. The Imperial technicians, standing in the control pits, pushed the physical firing levers forward. Thick cables transferred pure energy from the main hypermatter reactor into the focusing lenses. 8 separate beams of green plasma ignited around the perimeter of the firing dish, converging at the central focal point to create a single, massive beam. The laser struck the surface of Alderaan, instantly penetrating the planetary crust and reaching the core. The immense energy destabilized the planet's internal pressure, causing the entire sphere to fracture and explode outward in a blinding flash of white light. The physical destruction of the planet instantly vaporized billions of sentience, leaving only the expanding field of asteroids that the Millennium Falcon now navigated. Han steered the ship through the drifting rocks, following the ion trail of a lone Imperial TIE fighter darting between the debris. He pushed the throttle forward, pursuing the twin-engine ship toward a small, grey moon visible in the distance. As the Falcon drew closer, the physical details of the moon became clear. The surface consisted entirely of overlapping durasteel plates, deep equatorial trenches, and thousands of protruding turbolaser towers. Luke stared at the massive structure, realizing that it was not a moon, but the space station described in the stolen Rebel data plans. The ship's internal sensors began blaring a high-pitched alarm, indicating a massive magnetic force gripping the hull. The Death Star had activated its primary tractor beam projectors. Han pulled desperately on the control yoke and slammed his hand against the physical thruster controls, attempting to reverse the ship's momentum. The engines whined loudly, struggling against the invisible magnetic field, but the ship continued to drift forward toward the station. The tractor beam pulled the Millennium Falcon across the vast exterior surface of the Death Star, drawing it toward a massive, rectangular docking bay cut into the equatorial trench. The ship passed through the atmospheric containment field of the hangar, the blue glow of the energy shield illuminating the cockpit. The Falcon descended slowly toward the polished black floor of the docking bay, surrounded by hundreds of stormtroopers and Imperial officers waiting on the landing platform. Han shut down the main drive engines, cutting the power to the ship's external lights. The loud hum of the sublight thrusters faded, leaving the cockpit in complete silence. He turned to Luke and Obi-Wan, pulling his blaster pistol from its holster. He instructed the group to move quickly to the ship's hidden smuggling compartments, located beneath the deck plates. The crew climbed down through physical access hatches in the floor, settling into the cramped, unlit spaces between the inner hull and the outer armor plating. They lay flat on the cold metal, listening to the heavy boots of the Imperial stormtroopers marching up the boarding ramp and opening the main airlock. The troopers stepped into the main hold, carrying physical scanning devices and heavy blaster rifles, completely unaware of the crew hiding directly beneath their feet. Han, Luke, and Obi-Wan emerged from the smuggling compartments after the stormtroopers exited the ship. Han grabbed a physical comlink from the wall and triggered the heavy metal ramp to lower. He shot the two stormtroopers guarding the base of the ramp, hitting them squarely in the white chest plates. The group dragged the bodies inside and stripped the armor off the troopers. Han and Luke put on the white plastic plating and the heavy helmets, while Obi-Wan moved quietly toward the docking bay exit. They marched down the ramp, escorting Chewbacca as a physical prisoner to bypass the scanning crews working near the main elevators. They entered a small control room overlooking the hangar, stunned the Imperial officers sitting at the monitoring consoles, and locked the heavy durasteel door behind them. R2-D2 plugged his metal slicing arm directly into the Death Star's central computer network. The droid accessed the primary schematics and displayed a physical map of the station on the console screen. R2-D2 pinpointed the location of the tractor beam power generators and the holding cell block where Princess Leia was currently detained. Obi-Wan stepped away from the console, unhooking his lightsaber from his belt. He stated he would physically disconnect the tractor beam terminals to allow the Millennium Falcon to launch, telling the others to rescue the princess. He pulled his brown hood over his head and slipped out into the grey corridors of the station. Han, Luke, and Chewbacca took the main elevator down to detention block AA-23. They stepped out of the lift, Han and Luke still wearing the stormtrooper armor, and pointed their blasters at the Imperial guards sitting at the security desk. Han fired his weapon, shattering the main console and dropping the guards to the floor. Luke found the physical control panel for Cell 2187 and pressed the release button. The heavy metal door slid open, revealing Princess Leia resting on a flat, unpadded metal slab. Luke removed his stormtrooper helmet and told her they were there to rescue her, explaining that he had brought her astromech droid and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Squads of stormtroopers converged on the cell block, firing heavily through the main elevator shaft. The blaster bolts shattered the wall panels and filled the narrow corridor with thick grey smoke. Leia grabbed a blaster from Luke's hand, pointed it at a small circular grate in the wall, and fired. The metal grate blew completely off its hinges, exposing a dark, vertical shaft used for garbage disposal. Leia dove headfirst into the opening, sliding down the metal chute. Luke, Han, and Chewbacca followed her, dropping into a large rectangular room filled with deep pools of putrid water and physical debris. The walls of the room consisted of massive, motorized steel plates. The stormtroopers above triggered the disposal sequence, and the heavy metal walls began to slide inward, pushing the floating garbage together with immense hydraulic pressure. Luke pulled his comlink and yelled over the grinding metal, ordering C-3PO and R2-D2 to override the compactor controls. R2-D2 accessed the primary mainframe and electronically halted the motors just before the steel walls crushed the group. The crew climbed out of the garbage compactor and ran back through the station corridors toward the Millennium Falcon. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan Kenobi walked across a narrow metal bridge spanning a deep, illuminated reactor shaft. He approached the central terminal and manually pulled the large power levers downward, completely disabling the magnetic field of the tractor beam. As he turned to walk back to the hangar, Darth Vader stepped out from the shadows at the end of the corridor. Vader ignited his red lightsaber, the low hum vibrating through the metal walls. Obi-Wan activated his blue blade, and the two warriors clashed, their weapons striking against each other and showering the dark corridor with bright sparks. Han, Luke, Leia, and the droids reached the main hangar bay. They ran up the boarding ramp of the Millennium Falcon, firing their blasters to keep the stormtroopers pinned behind the cargo crates. Luke stopped at the base of the ramp and looked across the massive docking bay. He saw Obi-Wan and Vader fighting near the blast doors. Obi-Wan looked directly at Luke, raised his lightsaber vertically in front of his face, and completely stopped defending himself. Vader swung his red blade horizontally, striking Obi-Wan's robe. The physical body of the old Jedi completely vanished, leaving only his empty brown cloak and his metal lightsaber falling to the deck plating. Luke fired his blaster at the stormtroopers, shouting loudly as Han grabbed his arm and pulled him into the ship. Han ran to the cockpit and slammed the throttle forward. With the tractor beam disabled, the Millennium Falcon blasted out of the hangar bay, clearing the magnetic shield and entering the vacuum of space. 4 Imperial TIE fighters pursued them, firing green plasma bolts at the rear deflector shields. Han and Luke climbed into the quad laser turrets mounted on the top and bottom of the freighter. They gripped the heavy firing handles, physically tracking the small twin-engine fighters through the targeting computers. They fired rapid bursts of red laser fire, hitting the solar panels of the TI fighters and destroying all 4 pursuing ships. The Millennium Falcon cleared the immediate Imperial blockade, jumped into hyperspace, and navigated directly to the hidden Rebel base on Yavin 4, carrying the Princess and the Death Star plans to the waiting Alliance leaders. General Yan Dodonna stood at the center of the Massassi Temple Command Center, surrounded by solid stone walls covered in hanging moss. He held a thin metal pointer and tapped it against a glowing blue holoprojection of the Imperial Death Star. He traced the metal tip along a specific equatorial trench, stopping at a small circular thermal exhaust port measuring exactly 2 meters wide. He stated the port connected directly to the station's main hypermatter reactor through a straight, exposed ventilation shaft. Dozens of rebel pilots wearing bright orange flight suits, heavy white chest panels, and helmets fitted with sliding yellow blast shields sat on metal folding chairs, looking at the projection. Luke Skywalker sat in the front row, holding his helmet in his lap, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the molded plastic. Outside the temple on the cleared dirt landing strips, mechanics dragged heavy rubber fuel hoses across the mud and pumped liquid coaxium into the tanks of parked X-Wing and Y-Wing starfighters. The ground crew manually hoisted physical proton torpedoes up to the undercarriage racks, locking them into place with heavy steel clamps. The pilots walked out of the temple, their boots sinking into the wet soil, and climbed tall metal ladders to reach their cockpits. They dropped into the narrow seats, pulling heavy nylon restraints over their shoulders and plugging the life support hoses into their chest boxes. Astromech droids rolled onto the hydraulic lifts and slid into the external sockets, positioned directly behind the cockpits. The pilots flipped rows of metal toggle switches on their dashboards, and the starfighter engines ignited. The sudden thrust blew hot exhaust gas and loose foliage across the perimeter of the jungle clearing. The 30 ships lifted vertically off the ground, retracted their landing gear, and angled their noses upward, breaking through the thick green canopy to enter the dark vacuum of space above the moon. Earlier that morning, Han Solo and Chewbacca had carried heavy iron lockboxes across the hangar floor, loading them onto the boarding ramp of the Millennium Falcon. The lockboxes contained solid gold credit ingots provided by the rebel leaders as payment for rescuing Princess Leia. Han pushed the boxes into the cargo hold, secured the metal ramp, and launched his heavily modified freighter out of the Yavin atmosphere, prioritizing the physical payment over the impending military conflict. In the space above the red gas giant Yavin, the Death Star reverted from hyperspace. The massive spherical station brought its heavy durasteel hull into high orbit, blocking out the light of the distant sun. The Imperial command crew standing in the control pits looked at their physical targeting screens. They required 30 minutes to orbit the gas giant and secure an open firing line on the green moon of Yavin 4. The rebel starfighters approached the grey metallic surface of the station, locking their split foils into their open attack positions. The station's surface consisted of thousands of square miles of interlocking armor plates, protruding sensor arrays, and deep communication towers. Imperial gunners sitting inside the turbo laser batteries rotated their heavy cannons on motorized swivels, pointing the dual barrels at the incoming ships. Green laser fire erupted from the surface, filling the surrounding space with thick, deadly energy bolts. The rebel pilots pushed their flight yokes forward, diving their ships through the web of laser fire and dropping closely over the metal surface. 3 Y-wing bombers descended into a narrow artificial trench cut deep into the station's armor. They flew entirely below the firing arc of the surface turbo lasers, navigating between thick cooling pipes and raised exhaust vents. Inside the main hangar bay of the Death Star, Darth Vader climbed into the cockpit of his modified TE Advanced X-1 starfighter. He gripped the steering yoke with his black leather gloves, and the ship dropped out of the hangar bay alongside 2 standard TIE fighters. Vader flew his ship down into the trench, bringing his vehicle directly behind the rebel bombers. He aligned his targeting crosshairs on the central Y-wing and pressed his thumbs against the firing studs. Red laser bolts struck the heavy armor plating of the Y-wing, tearing the port engine nacelle apart. The bombers spun out of control, crashing into the metal trench wall in a massive burst of orange flame and scattered debris. Vader systematically tracked and shot down the remaining ships entering the trench, his laser fire piercing their deflector shields and detonating their fuel lines. Luke Skywalker banked his X-wing sharply and dropped into the trench, pushing his throttle lever to maximum capacity. Vader followed closely behind, matching Luke's speed and locking his computerized targeting system onto the rear thrusters of Luke's starfighter. Vader's thumb rested on the firing button, prepared to release the lethal burst of energy. A sudden barrage of heavy red laser fire struck the right solar panel of the TIE fighter, flying adjacent to Vader. The Millennium Falcon swooped down from the dark space directly above the trench. Han Solo sat in the pilot's seat, his hands gripping the controls of the quad laser cannons, firing directly at the Imperial pursuit ships. The physical impact of the laser fire caused the second TIE fighter to swerve sharply to the side, crashing its left panel directly into the hull of Vader's ship. The collision sent Vader's TIE Advanced spinning wildly out of the trench, bouncing off the magnetic shielding and hurtling away into the deep vacuum of space. Luke reached out with his gloved hand and flipped a physical toggle switch on his dashboard, powering down his computerized targeting system. He pushed the yellow blast visor up into his helmet and looked straight out the front viewport. He squeezed the firing trigger on his flight stick. 2 proton torpedoes shot out from the underside of the X-wing, glowing with bright pink energy. The torpedoes traveled down the narrow thermal exhaust port, navigating the vertical shaft and impacting the main hypermatter reactor. Luke pulled his flight yoke back, steering his X-wing straight up and away from the station's surface. The core of the Death Star detonated. The resulting explosion expanded outward from the center, instantly vaporizing the heavy durasteel plates, the turbo laser towers, and the Imperial personnel inside a blinding sphere of white-hot plasma. The physical shockwave scattered charred metallic debris across the orbit of Yavin. Luke, Han, and the surviving rebel pilots steered their starfighters back toward the jungle moon. They prepared to land their scorched vessels on the dirt pads, shut down their smoking engines, and step down from their cockpits to stand together on the ancient stone floor of the temple. The surviving X-wing and Y-wing starfighters extended their heavy durasteel landing gear and touched down on the mud-packed runways outside the Great Temple on Yavin 4. The hot sublight engines hissed as they cooled in the humid jungle air, releasing thick clouds of white steam across the clearing. Water droplets condensed on the scorched hull plating of the fighters, dripping down onto the wet dirt. Luke Skywalker climbed down the metal ladder of his starfighter, his boots hitting the wet soil, and walked toward the waiting crowds of rebel technicians, mechanics, and sentries. Han Solo lowered the main boarding ramp of the Millennium Falcon, stepping down the metal incline alongside Chewbacca. Deep inside the stone pyramids, rebel intelligence officers sat at heavy communication consoles and recorded the exact chronological data of the Death Star's destruction. They typed specific numeric sequences into their illuminated keyboards, establishing a new baseline for all Alliance planetary logs. The officers designated the exact moment of the station's explosion as Year Zero. They adjusted the physical chronometers on every datapad, navigation computer, and sensor array, resetting the galactic calendar to mark events as occurring before or after this specific battle. Couriers carried physical data disks from the command center to the outlying communication towers, transmitting the updated chronometric standards across the encrypted HoloNet channels through massive orbital satellite dishes. Slicers on distant worlds received these transmissions, physically rewiring their local network hubs and typing new command strings to align with the newly synchronized timeline. The destruction of the massive battle station caused a rapid physical change within the Alliance encampments. Rebel quartermasters unlocked heavy iron storage vaults and distributed newly acquired blasters, power packs, and medical kits to long lines of waiting volunteers. Cargo shuttles from previously unaligned systems landed on the jungle moon, dropping their heavy ramps to unload crates of Tibanna gas, heavy artillery shells, and sealed emergency rations. Rebel dock workers drove repulsor lift sleds across the hangar floor, stacking the metal crates into tall, organized columns. Soldiers from different planets traded their localized militia gear for standardized rebel combat vests and reinforced blast helmets. They dipped stiff bristle brushes into buckets of red paint, marking the crest of the Alliance onto the shoulders of their jackets and the side panels of their transport skiffs. Mechanics wheeled heavy hydraulic lifts into the hangars, physically attaching stolen Imperial repeating cannons onto the wings of civilian freighters and crop dusters. The scattered, isolated groups of insurgents converged into a singular, highly equipped military force. They stood in tightly formed ranks across the stone floors of the ancient Massassi temples, holding their standardized weapons and loading their transport shuttles with heavy physical munitions. Inside the main audience hall of the Great Temple, hundreds of rebel soldiers stood at absolute attention. The troops formed long, perfectly straight rows across the polished stone floor, their blaster rifles resting squarely against their shoulders. They wore matching earth-toned uniforms, polished black boots, and dark green combat helmets. Tall, thick banners bearing the Red Alliance starbird hung from the high vaulted ceiling, suspended by thick woven ropes. Bright lumen strips mounted along the upper walls cast strong, clear light across the assembled battalions. At the far end of the hall, Princess Leia Organa stood on a raised stone dais. She wore a pristine white dress and a thick silver necklace, holding a wooden box lined with dark velvet. Inside the box rested two heavy, gold-plated medallions hanging from long green silk ribbons. Luke Skywalker and Han Solo walked down the wide central aisle, their boots echoing loudly against the rock. Chewbacca walked slightly behind them, his heavy bowcaster slung across his thick bandolier. Luke wore a bright yellow jacket and dark trousers, while Han wore a clean white shirt and his standard black vest. They climbed the stone steps and stopped directly in front of the princess. Leia smiled, lifted the first gold medallion from the velvet box, and placed the green ribbon completely around Luke's neck. She took the second medallion and placed it around Han's neck. The heavy gold plates rested flat against their chests. The two men turned to face the assembled crowd. The rebel soldiers standing in the rows raised their hands and clapped loudly, their cheers bouncing off the carved stone walls of the ancient pyramid. The Alliance commanders, standing near the edges of the dais, watched the ceremony, holding physical star maps and target manifests in their hands. They planned to use the heavy munitions newly unloaded in the hangars and the fresh recruits standing in the hall to strike directly at the remaining Imperial infrastructure. The officers marked the coordinates of Imperial weapons factories, fuel processing refineries, and orbital supply depots on their datapads. They synchronized the navigation computers of their strike teams, preparing to launch their newly organized squadrons into the outer territories to attack the heavily guarded facilities before the Imperial fleet could physically rebuild their lost forces and retaliate. Following the destruction of the Death Star, rebel commanders gathered around the main holotables on Yavin 4. They dragged physical markers across the blue light of the galactic map, highlighting exposed Imperial shipyards and supply lines. The loss of the massive battle station had severely reduced the Empire's immediate orbital superiority, leaving their heavy manufacturing centers temporarily without adequate fleet protection. Mon Mothma and General Dodonna ordered the rebel squadrons to capitalize on this physical gap in the Imperial defense grid. Rebel technicians loaded heavy proton bombs and specialized breaching charges into the cargo holds of transport shuttles. The pilots strapped themselves into their Y-wing bombers and B-wing interceptors, launching from the jungle moon in continuous waves to physically strike the vulnerable targets across the mid-rim and the core worlds. One specific target required a specialized insertion team. The Imperial Weapons Factory on the moon of C-Moon 1 functioned as the primary manufacturing hub for AT-AT walkers and heavy turbo-laser cannons. The facility consisted of massive durasteel domes connected by thick, elevated transit tubes extending over a rocky, volcanic landscape. To severely cripple the Empire's physical ability to rebuild their ground forces, Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, and Princess Leia boarded the Millennium Falcon. They dressed in stolen Imperial officer uniforms, covering their rebel insignia with gray tunics and black rank cylinders. Han steered the Falcon past the orbital sensor buoys, transmitting forged clearance codes to the automated defense turrets. He landed the freighter on an external docking platform connected directly to the main manufacturing dome. Han, Luke, and Leia walked down the metal ramp, carrying heavy canvas bags filled with thermal detonators and concentrated explosive charges. They entered the main factory floor, stepping onto elevated metal catwalks that overlooked the assembly lines. Below them, thousands of mechanized arms welded heavy armor plates onto the skeletal frames of massive, four-legged walkers. The air inside the dome smelled strongly of burning metal, heavy lubricants, and the acrid smoke of continuous industrial welding. They walked quickly along the catwalks, avoiding the gaze of the Imperial supervisors patrolling the floor. They reached the central power core, a massive cylindrical structure pulsating with blue electrical energy. Han unzipped the canvas bags and began physically attaching the explosive charges directly to the core's primary coolant lines. He set the magnetic timers, twisting the physical dials to synchronize the detonations. Meanwhile, Luke stood guard near the heavy blast doors, holding his lightsaber unlit by his side. He looked through the thick transparent steel window of the door and saw a squad of stormtroopers marching down the corridor, accompanied by Darth Vader. Vader wore his black armor, his deep breathing cutting through the loud, mechanical noise of the factory. Luke recognized the physical presence of the man who had killed Obi-Wan Kenobi. He activated his blue lightsaber, the bright plasma blade illuminating the dark corridor. He stepped through the blast doors, standing directly in Vader's path. Vader stopped marching, his black helmet completely still as he looked at the blue blade. He ignited his own red lightsaber, and the two warriors clashed in the narrow hallway. Vader swung his heavy blade with immense physical force, driving Luke backward against the metal walls. Luke parried the strikes, struggling to match the sheer physical strength of the Sith Lord. Back in the core room, Han finished setting the final charge. He yelled to Leia, grabbing his blaster pistol and firing at the remaining Imperial technicians inside the room. They ran toward the blast doors, seeing Luke physically struggling to hold off Vader. Han fired a barrage of red plasma bolts at the Sith Lord, forcing Vader to deflect the shots with his lightsaber. The distraction provided Luke the exact physical opening he needed. He disengaged from the duel, deactivating his lightsaber and sprinting down the corridor alongside Han and Leia. They ran back toward the docking platform, their boots pounding against the metal grating. They climbed the boarding ramp of the Millennium Falcon just as the first explosive charge detonated in the core room. The resulting chain reaction tore through the coolant lines, sending superheated plasma straight into the main reactor. The massive durasteel dome fractured, exploding outward in a blinding flash of orange fire and twisted metal. The heavy machinery and the half-constructed AT-AT walkers collapsed into the molten rock below. The Millennium Falcon lifted off the platform, accelerating away from the moon as the physical shockwave rippled through the atmosphere. The destruction of the Cos-moos 1 facility completely halted the production of Imperial heavy walkers in that sector, creating a massive physical shortage in the Empire's ground assault capabilities. The success of the Cos-moos 1 raid inspired rebel cells across the galaxy to escalate their physical attacks. Saboteurs planted explosive charges on the hull plating of Imperial fuel transports, destroying entire shipments of refined coaxium before they could reach the Star Destroyer fleets. Slicers bypassed the physical security gates of Imperial data centers, downloading classified troop movements and transferring the physical data to rebel intelligence officers. The continuous string of physical attacks spread the Imperial forces thin, forcing them to deploy their remaining Star Destroyers across thousands of light-years to protect their vulnerable supply lines. This physically prevented the Empire from massing their fleets into a single, overwhelming armada. The Alliance had successfully capitalized on the destruction of the Death Star, striking at the physical foundation of the Imperial war machine and setting the stage for a prolonged, galaxy-wide conflict. Darth Vader stood on the command bridge of the Super Star Destroyer Executor. He looked through the thick transparasteel viewports at the black expanse of space and the distant, burning stars. He gripped the metal railing with his black leather gloves, his fingers pressing tightly against the cold steel. The explosion of the Death Star forced the Imperial commanders to reposition their surviving Star Destroyers across the galaxy. Vader breathed through his mechanical respirator, the loud rhythmic sound bouncing off the polished durasteel walls of the bridge. He commanded a specialized armada of Imperial vessels designated as Death Squadron. The officers sitting in the sunken crew pits below him typed specific coordinates into their tracking consoles, scanning the hyperspace lanes for rebel activity. Vader ordered his commanders to deploy thousands of black, multi-armed probe droids across the Outer Rim territories. The droids dropped from the heavy cruisers in cylindrical metal pods, hurtling through the atmospheres of hundreds of distant planets to photograph the terrain and transmit the images back to the Imperial fleet. A bounty hunter, wearing battered green and grey Mandalorian armor, walked onto the command bridge. The hunter approached Vader and handed him a physical data disk. Vader inserted the disk directly into the holotable. The screen displayed the face of the young rebel pilot from the Yavin battle. Green text scrolled beneath the image, displaying the specific designation Skywalker. Vader clenched his mechanical fist, pressing his reinforced digits into the leather of his glove. He ordered the fleet navigators to calculate jump routes to the most remote star systems, narrowing the search parameters specifically to track the heavily modified Corellian freighter and the pilot named Skywalker. The Rebel Alliance packed their weapons, medical supplies, and surviving starfighters into heavy transport ships. They departed the Massassi temples on Yavin 4, flying their ships far outside the established hyperspace routes to route their journey around the Imperial blockades. General Riecken rolled open a physical star chart onto a metal table and pointed his finger at the sixth planet in the Hoth system. The planet consisted entirely of frozen glaciers, deep snowdrifts, and jagged ice monoliths. The surface temperatures dropped to lethal extremes, instantly solidifying the liquid lubricants inside standard engine blocks and freezing the exposed fuel lines of standard vehicles. The rebel transports landed on the white plains of the ice planet. Mechanics and soldiers used heavy laser cutters to carve deep tunnels and massive hangars directly into the existing ice caves. They installed thick metal blast doors at the cave entrances and routed heavy insulated power cables along the frozen ceilings to connect the portable generators to the command consoles. Rebel technicians bolted heavy ion cannons to the snowy ridges outside the perimeter, aligning the long metal barrels with the orbital pathways above the planet. The soldiers designated this installation Echo Base. Inside the base, the air smelled of burning ozone, heated engine oil, and damp animal fur. The soldiers wore heavy white snowsuits, thick insulated gloves, and goggles with polarized lenses to filter the intense glare of the sun reflecting off the snowpack. Mechanics worked continuously on modified T-47 airspeeders in the main hangar bay. They wrapped thick thermal tape around the exposed steering cables and bolted heavy heating units directly to the exterior engine blocks to maintain operation in the extreme cold. Other soldiers rode large, bipedal reptiles covered in thick white fur, identified as tauntauns. The riders sat on brown leather saddles, gripping thick leather reins to steer the animals across the deep snowdrifts. They patrolled the perimeter of the base, holding macro binoculars to their eyes to scan the vast white horizon for Imperial ships and listening to the crunch of the snow beneath the creatures' heavy claws. A cylindrical metal pod crashed into a high snowbank just outside the primary defensive ridge of Echo Base. The impact threw large chunks of packed ice across the plain and melted the surrounding snow into pools of boiling water. The metal casing cracked open, and a dark grey Viper probe droid floated out of the crater using a small repulsor lift engine. The droid featured a domed head covered in specialized optical sensors and multiple jointed metal arms hanging below its chassis. It floated across the frozen terrain, its lenses focusing specifically on the heavy shield generators and the laser turrets surrounding the rebel base. The droid extended a long, thin antenna from its dome and broadcasted a high-frequency encoded signal straight up through the planet's atmosphere. Millions of light-years away, the communication officers aboard the Executor received the transmission. The officers printed the physical telemetry data onto a thin flimsiplast sheet and handed it to Darth Vader. Vader looked at the grainy holographic image of the Rebel shield generator projected on the console. He pointed his black-gloved finger at the screen and instructed his admiral to set the fleet's course for the Hoth system. The Imperial officers pulled the heavy hyperspace levers on their command consoles, and the massive Star Destroyers accelerated into light speed, carrying thousands of heavily armored ground troops and massive walking assault vehicles directly toward the frozen planet. Darth Vader stood at the front of the Executor's bridge, watching the swirling blue tunnel of hyperspace snap back into the stark black void filled with stars. The massive Super Star Destroyer entered the Hoth system, flanked closely by 3 standard Imperial Star Destroyers. The heavy cruisers moved into high orbit above the ice planet, their massive sensor dishes sweeping the frozen surface for energy signatures. Admiral Ozzel stood behind Vader, his hands clasped firmly behind his back, and reported that a Rebel shield generator was physically present on the planet. Vader instructed Ozzel to deploy the ground forces beyond the perimeter of the energy shield. The Imperial officers relayed the specific coordinates to the landing craft waiting in the lower hangar bays. The heavy Durasteel doors of the Imperial hangars slid open, completely exposing the bays to the vacuum of space. Massive landing barges, built entirely of thick grey metal and repulsor lift engines, descended from the bellies of the Star Destroyers. The barges entered the atmosphere of Hoth, dropping through the freezing clouds and landing heavily on the thick snowpack kilometers outside of Echo Base. The heavy loading ramps lowered into the snow, and towering bipedal walkers, designated ATSTs, stepped out first to secure the physical landing zone. Behind them, massive four-legged AT-AT walkers marched down the ramps. These heavy assault vehicles stood over 20 meters tall, covered in heavy armor plating impervious to standard blaster fire. The walkers possessed heavy laser cannons mounted beneath their primary cockpits and moved across the frozen plains with a slow, heavy, mechanical gait, their immense metal feet crushing the deep snowdrifts. Inside Echo Base, the rebel klaxons blared continuously, bouncing off the carved ice walls. Rebel soldiers ran down the narrow corridors, grabbing their blaster rifles and heavy repeating cannons from the metal storage racks. General Rieken stood at the central command console, ordering all personnel to immediately evacuate the base and board the heavy transport ships waiting in the main hangar. He instructed the ground troops to take up physical defensive positions in the ice trenches outside to delay the Imperial advance. The rebel soldiers marched out of the tunnels and dropped into the deep trenches carved directly into the snowpack. They mounted their heavy repeating blasters on the ice walls, pointing the barrels toward the vast white horizon. Luke Skywalker climbed into the cockpit of a modified T-47 airspeeder, accompanied by his gunner, Dak Rulter. The snowspeeders featured flat, wedge-shaped hulls, twin laser cannons, and rear-mounted harpoon guns trailing heavy tow cables. Luke and his squadron of airspeeders launched from the hangar, flying low over the frozen plain toward the advancing line of Imperial walkers. The rebel pilots fired their laser cannons directly at the thick armor plating of the AT-ATs. The red plasma bolts deflected harmlessly off the metal hulls, leaving only shallow scorch marks on the gray paint. Luke pressed his comlink, physically ordering his pilots to utilize their tow cables. He flew his speeder directly past the legs of a towering walker, instructing Dak to fire the harpoon into the rear ankle joint. The metal harpoon pierced the armor, physically locking the heavy cable to the walker's leg. Luke pulled the flight yoke hard, flying the speeder in tight, continuous circles around the AT-AT's mechanical legs, wrapping the metal cable multiple times around the heavy joints. He released the cable, and the walker attempted to step forward. The bound legs locked together, completely arresting its forward momentum, and the massive metal vehicle crashed face first into the deep snow, its chassis fracturing upon impact. Despite the physical destruction of a few walkers, the Imperial advance continued. The AT-ATs fired their heavy chin cannons at the rebel trenches, blowing massive chunks of ice and snow into the air. The heavy laser bolts completely vaporized the rebel repeating blasters and sent the soldiers diving for cover deep within the frozen trenches. The walkers marched steadily toward the main shield generator, a massive structure consisting of 4 thick metal discs aligned in a row. The lead AT-AT lowered its cannons and fired a concentrated volley directly into the generator's power core. The metal discs exploded, showering the snow with burning debris and instantly dropping the invisible energy shield protecting Echo Base. With the shield deactivated, Darth Vader's personal shuttle landed near the base entrance. Vader marched down the ramp, followed by a battalion of snowtroopers wearing specialized white armor and heavy fabric armors. They entered the ice tunnels, firing their E-11 blasters at the remaining rebel defenders, attempting to hold the corridors. Han Solo and Princess Leia ran through the collapsing base, avoiding the falling chunks of ice, and boarded the Millennium Falcon. Han bypassed the failing ignition sequences, physically sparking the exposed wires to start the engines, and the freighter blasted out of the hangar, just as the snowtroopers breached the heavy durasteel doors. The remaining rebel transport ships launched from the hidden bays, completely abandoning the frozen planet as the Imperial Army physically occupied the destroyed corridors of Echo Base. The Millennium Falcon blasted away from the white surface of Hoth, leaving the frozen atmosphere and entering the black vacuum of space. 4 Imperial Star Destroyers moved to intercept the fleeing freighter. The Imperial gunners, sitting in the command pits, fired green turbolaser bolts at the ship, illuminating the dark space around them. Han Solo sat in the pilot's seat and pulled the heavy metallic hyperdrive lever backward. The physical gears ground together, sending a shower of yellow sparks across the control console as the primary motivator stalled, forcing the ship to rely entirely on its sublight engines. Consequently, Han pushed the steering yoke forward, pointing the ship directly toward a dense cluster of massive floating rocks orbiting the neighboring planets. He flew the Falcon into the Hoth asteroid field, weaving the wide, saucer-shaped hull between the rapidly colliding boulders. The Imperial TIE fighters followed closely behind, matching the freighter's erratic maneuvers. The heavy rocks smashed directly into the hexagonal solar panels of the pursuing fighters, shattering the Imperial ships into pieces and sending flaming debris scattering across the field. Furthermore, massive boulders crashed against the deflector shields of the Star Destroyers, sending bright flashes of static energy rippling across their invisible barriers. Han located a massive crater on the surface of one of the largest asteroids and flew the Falcon inside, landing the ship on the soft, wet floor of a dark, narrow cavern. Inside the ship, Princess Leia, Chewbacca, and C-3PO powered down the main electrical grids to evade the Imperial thermal scanners sweeping the area outside. The temperature inside the cockpit dropped rapidly, forming thick layers of white frost on the transparasteel viewports. Han and Leia walked into the main hold, putting on heavy fabric jackets and strapping specialized breathing masks over their faces to step outside onto the cavern floor. They carried handheld blasters, aiming the weapons at leathery winged parasites known as Minocs, chewing on the external power cables of the ship. The ground beneath their heavy boots shifted and contracted rhythmically. Han fired his blaster into the fleshy cavern wall, causing the entire tunnel to shake violently. They recognized the cavern consisted entirely of the digestive tract of a massive, space-dwelling exogorth. Han and Leia ran back up the boarding ramp, and Han ignited the sublight engines. The Falcon flew straight out of the creature's mouth, just as the massive jaws lined with jagged white teeth clamped together behind the exhaust thrusters. Meanwhile, Luke Skywalker steered his X-Wing starfighter far away from the Hoth system. He looked at the physical coordinates displayed on his navigation computer and directed the ship toward the Dagobah system. The X-Wing entered the thick, gray atmosphere of the swamp planet. Heavy cloud cover obstructed the light of the sun, and the ship's sensor arrays sparked and lost power. Luke pulled the flight yoke backward, attempting to level the craft manually. The starfighter crashed through a thick canopy of knotted wooden branches and slammed directly into a deep pool of dark, muddy water. Luke unlatched his heavy nylon harness, pushed the cockpit canopy open, and climbed out onto the long metal nose of the sinking ship. Thick green moss hung from the surrounding trees, and large reptilian creatures swam through the murky water. R2-D2 rolled off the back of the ship and splashed into the swamp, requiring Luke to use a heavy mechanical winch cable to drag the metal droid onto the muddy shoreline. A small, green-skinned creature wearing a tattered brown robe walked out of the dense foliage, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. Luke looked at the being, perceiving him simply as a local swamp scavenger. The creature instructed Luke to follow him to a small, dome-shaped hut constructed entirely of dried mud and woven tree roots. Inside the hut, the creature revealed himself as Jedi Master Yoda and fed Luke a thick, hot root stew served in small wooden bowls. Following the meal, Yoda initiated Luke's physical Jedi training. Luke ran through the thick swamp water, carrying Yoda on his back in a canvas harness. He climbed thick, hanging vines and performed front flips over exposed tree roots. Yoda instructed Luke to lift heavy, moss-covered rocks using solely the physical manipulation of the Force. Sweat dripped down Luke's face, mixing with the thick grime of the swamp. His muscles ached as he held the heavy stones suspended in the air. He turned his attention to his submerged X-wing, extending his hand to physically lift the heavy metal craft from the water. High above the Hoth asteroid field, Darth Vader stood on the command bridge of the Executor. The Star Destroyers continued to bombard the floating rocks with heavy turbo-laser fire. Vader ordered his officers to line up a group of 6 heavily armed bounty hunters across the metal grating of the bridge. These individuals wore mismatched armor, carried specialized blaster rifles, and utilized advanced thermal tracking equipment. One hunter resembled a tall reptilian humanoid wearing a yellow flight suit, while another stood as a completely metallic droid covered in rusted plating. Vader walked down the line, stopping specifically in front of a hunter wearing battered green and gray Mandalorian armor. Vader instructed the hunter, Boba Fett, to locate the Millennium Falcon using any physical methods necessary. The bounty hunters returned to their uniquely designed starships and launched from the hangar bays, calculating physical pursuit trajectories to track the rebel freighter across the galaxy toward a massive, floating gas mining facility suspended high within the pink clouds of the planet Bespin. Boba Fett flew his heavily modified fire spray gunship, the Slave One, closely behind the Millennium Falcon. He maintained a physical distance just outside the range of the Falcon's aft sensor arrays, tracking the specific ion emissions leaking from the freighter's damaged sublight engines. The ships entered the atmosphere of Bespin, a massive gas giant composed entirely of thick, swirling clouds of pink and orange Tibanna gas. Han Solo steered the Falcon through the dense vapor, approaching Cloud City. The facility consisted of a massive, flat metal disc suspended high above the gas core by a long, cylindrical repulsor lift column. The city housed luxury casinos, tall white spires, and thousands of industrial gas processing platforms on its lower levels. Han extended the Falcon's landing gear and set the ship down on a wide, circular landing pad bordered by low white walls. Lando Calrissian, the Baron Administrator of Cloud City, walked across the landing pad to meet the crew. He wore a bright blue cape with a gold lining over a clean pressed shirt. Lando offered Han the physical use of the city's repair facilities to fix the Falcon's hyperdrive. He led the group into a large dining room with wide transparasteel windows overlooking the pink clouds. As the durasteel doors slid open, Darth Vader stood at the head of a long, polished dining table, flanked by 4 white-armored stormtroopers. Boba Fett stood quietly in the corner, holding his blaster rifle. Lando had physically surrendered the city's operations to the Imperial forces after they arrived hours before the Falcon. The stormtroopers raised their blasters, completely disarming Han and Chewbacca. They bound the prisoners' wrists with heavy metal cuffs and escorted them down into the lower, industrial levels of the city. Inside the city's carbon freezing facility, heavy machinery groaned continuously, pumping liquid carbonite through thick metal pipes. The room glowed with orange and red light, reflecting off the steam rising from the central freezing pit. Imperial technicians adjusted the physical pressure valves on the main control console. Darth Vader intended to freeze Luke Skywalker in the carbonite block to physically transport him to the Emperor. Vader ordered the technicians to test the freezing process on Han Solo first to ensure the equipment functioned properly. Chewbacca roared loudly, throwing a stormtrooper off the platform, but he stopped when Han physically placed his cuffed hands on the Wookiee's chest. An automated claw lowered Han into the deep freezing pit. The technicians activated the pumps, spraying liquid carbonite into the chamber. The metallic liquid rapidly hardened around Han's body, completely encasing him in a solid block of dark grey metal. Boba Fett instructed several Ugnaught workers to load the heavy carbonite slab onto a repulsor lift sled and pushed the frozen smuggler toward his ship, intending to physically collect a massive bounty from the gangster Jabba the Hutt. Meanwhile, Luke Skywalker arrived at Cloud City in his X-Wing starfighter, his astromech droid tracking the physical location of the captured crew. Luke walked down the quiet white corridors, his lightsaber unhooked and held loosely in his right hand. He entered the carbon-freezing chamber just as the stormtroopers escorted Leia and Chewbacca toward Vader's shuttle. Luke stepped onto the raised circular platform, and Darth Vader emerged from the thick orange steam. Vader ignited his red lightsaber, and Luke activated his blue blade. The two clashed violently, their lightsabers sparking against the heavy metal pipes and slicing through the thick power cables lining the walls. Vader swung his blade with heavy, one-handed strikes, driving Luke backward through a shattered window and onto a narrow maintenance gantry suspended over the massive central ventilation shaft. Fierce wind ripped through the shaft, threatening to physically push Luke off the narrow metal walkway. Vader pressed his attack, slicing through the metal handrails and forcing Luke to the very edge of the gantry. Luke swung his blade down, aiming for Vader's shoulder, but the Sith Lord easily parried the strike. Vader brought his red blade across in a swift, horizontal arc, physically severing Luke's right hand at the wrist. Luke's hand, still gripping the blue lightsaber, fell into the dark, bottomless shaft below. Luke collapsed onto the metal grating, grasping his severed arm. Vader stood over him, the red glow of his lightsaber illuminating the dark wind tunnel, and stated clearly that he was Luke's father. He extended his black-gloved hand, demanding Luke physically join him to rule the galaxy. Luke looked at the extended hand, pushed himself backward, and dropped entirely off the gantry into the dark void. Luke fell through the vertical wind tunnel, sliding down a smooth, curved metal chute. He physically tumbled through a narrow exterior hatch and landed hard against a thin weather vane, extending outward from the very bottom of the floating city. He gripped the cold metal antenna with his remaining hand, his legs dangling freely over the massive gas clouds of Bespin. He pulled his comlink and broadcast a physical signal through the Force, reaching out to Princess Leia. Aboard the Millennium Falcon, Leia heard the transmission in her mind. She ordered Lando, who had freed them from the stormtroopers, to physically turn the ship around. Lando pulled the control yoke, flying the Falcon directly beneath the floating city. He hovered the ship closely under the weather vane, aligning the top hatch with Luke's position. Luke dropped from the antenna, sliding onto the metal hull of the ship, and Lando pulled him inside through the airlock. The Falcon blasted out of the Bespin atmosphere and jumped into hyperspace, carrying the severely wounded Jedi away from the Imperial fleet and leaving Han Solo entirely frozen in carbonite aboard Boba Fett's accelerating gunship. The Millennium Falcon extended its heavy magnetic docking clamps and attached directly to the exterior airlock of a massive rebel medical frigate. Inside the brightly lit medical bay, a surgical droid with multiple articulated metal arms hovered over Luke Skywalker. The droid grafted a skeletal metal hand onto Luke's severed wrist, soldering thin copper wires directly to his exposed nerve endings. Luke flexed the metallic fingers, watching the mechanical servos pull the synthetic tendons tight. A metal needle punctured his synthetic skin, testing the sensory feedback loop. Luke watched the needle prick the artificial flesh and nodded to the medical droid. Lando Calrissian and Chewbacca sat in the starboard cockpit of the Falcon. Lando pushed the throttle levers forward, releasing the magnetic clamps and separating the freighter from the medical ship. They flew the Falcon away from the fleet, inputting specific numerical coordinates into the navigation computer to track the Mandalorian bounty hunter across the Outer Rim territories. In the dense, lower industrial levels of Coruscant, a team of Bothan operatives wearing dark grey stealth suits sliced into a heavily guarded Imperial data hub. They plugged thick data cables into the main server racks, downloading encrypted schematics onto portable hard drives. The cooling fans of the server banks hummed loudly, masking the sound of their heavy boots on the metal grating. Imperial stormtroopers breached the server room, firing concentrated bursts of green plasma from their E-11 blasters. The plasma bolts struck the Bothans, burning holes through their armor and dropping their bodies onto the polished Durasteel floor. The surviving operatives grabbed the blood-stained hard drives and sprinted down the narrow ventilation shafts. They handed the drives to rebel couriers waiting in heavily modified cargo skiffs. These couriers flew the drives directly to the rebel command fleet, handing the physical metal rectangles to Mon Mothma. The files displayed rotating blue holograms of a second, significantly larger Death Star orbiting the forest moon of Endor. High above the green, tree-covered surface of Endor, millions of construction droids welded massive Durasteel plates onto the skeletal frame of the new battle station. The structure measured hundreds of kilometers across, featuring a wide, exposed equatorial trench and a massive, concave superlaser dish spanning the upper hemisphere. A Lambda-class Imperial shuttle landed in the main hangar bay. Emperor Palpatine walked down the metal ramp, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane. He wore a dark black robe that dragged across the shiny black floor, his wrinkled skin and yellow eyes visible beneath his deep hood. Darth Vader walked beside him, his mechanical breathing echoing through the vast, open hangar. Rows of white-armored stormtroopers, grey-uniformed Imperial officers, and red-clad royal guards stood in perfectly straight lines, holding their physical weapons at absolute attention. Palpatine walked slowly past the troops, inspecting the physical progress of the construction. He handed physical data disks containing the exact coordinates of the station's shield generator to double agents, setting a massive physical trap to draw the entire Alliance fleet into a single, heavily fortified sector. On the desert planet of Tatooine, Luke Skywalker sat cross-legged on the dirt floor of a dark, rocky cave. He placed small metal components on a woven cloth mat in front of him. He used specialized prongs to align a green focusing crystal inside a cylindrical metal hilt. He attached the magnetic activator switch and screwed the heavy pommel cap onto the base of the cylinder. Luke pressed the physical switch, and a bright green plasma blade ignited with a loud, vibrating hum. The green light illuminated the rough stone walls of the cave, casting long shadows across the dirt. He pressed the switch again, retracting the green plasma back into the metal hilt, hooked the metal cylinder onto his brown leather belt, and walked out into the intense heat of the twin suns beating down on the sand. A massive, dome-shaped stone palace sat at the edge of the Dune Sea. Jabba the Hutt, a massive gastropod crime lord with thick, green-brown skin, resided inside the central chamber. surrounded by armed mercenaries, bounty hunters, and alien musicians. The heavy carbonite block containing Han Solo hung securely on the stone wall of Jabba's main audience room. Two droids, C-3PO and R2-D2, walked across the shifting sand dunes toward the heavy iron gate of the palace. C-3PO raised his golden metal hand and knocked on the thick iron door. A small metal panel slid open, and an electronic eye extended outward on a metal stalk, scanning the two droids. The heavy gate rose vertically, grinding loudly against the stone archway, and allowing the droids to enter the dark, damp interior corridor of the fortress. Deep inside the palace, Lando Calrissian wore the heavy armor and horned helmet of a skiff guard. He carried a long metal force pike, walking the perimeter of the audience chamber and monitoring the locations of Jabba's mercenaries. Princess Leia Organa walked through the main archway wearing the specialized armor and helmet of a bounty hunter named Boushh. She held a metallic thermal detonator in her gloved hand, pressing her thumb directly onto the sliding arming switch. She led the towering Wookiee, Chewbacca, bound entirely in heavy iron chains. Jabba the Hutt looked down from his elevated stone dais, examining the captured Wookiee and the armed bounty hunter. Leia pushed Chewbacca forward, handing the ends of the heavy iron chains to Jabba's Gamorrean guards. She stood near the back wall, watching the rotation of the guards, preparing to walk down into the dimly lit alcove to thaw the carbonite and extract the frozen smuggler from the heavy metal slab. Leia pulled down the heavy faceplate of the Boushh helmet, the built-in vocoder altering her voice into a deep electronic growl. She pressed a sequence of buttons on the thermal detonator, the red light turning solid as the internal mechanisms primed the explosive charge. She demanded a massive sum of physical credits from Jabba for the delivery of the Wookiee. Jabba laughed, his deep, rumbling voice vibrating through the stone chamber. He offered her a smaller physical bounty, extending his thick, green hand toward her. Leia deactivated the detonator, returning the metal sphere to her belt, and accepted the physical payment. Later that night, when the palace grew quiet and the guards slept on the stone floors, Leia walked silently down to the alcove. She pressed the release sequence on the control panel, mounted next to the carbonite block. The dark gray metal began to glow brightly with orange heat, physically melting away from Han's body. He collapsed forward onto the stone floor, his clothes stiff with frost, shivering violently as Leia removed her helmet and wrapped her arms around him. Suddenly, a loud, booming laugh echoed through the dark alcove. Jabba the Hutt emerged from the shadows, physically flanked by a dozen heavily armed mercenaries. Gamorrean guards grabbed Han and Leia, dragging them roughly toward the main audience chamber. Jabba threw Han into a damp, stone dungeon cell located beneath the main floor. He ordered his guards to physically chain Leia to his dais, forcing her to wear a thin metal collar attached to a heavy iron chain. The next day, Luke Skywalker walked into the main hall of the palace. He wore a dark black tunic and a long black cloak, his mechanical right hand completely covered by a black leather glove. He stood before Jabba, raising his hand and physically projecting the force to manipulate the minds of the guards blocking his path. Luke demanded the immediate release of Han Solo and the others. Jabba refused, physically slamming his massive fist onto an activation panel hidden on his dais. The stone floor beneath Luke dropped away completely, revealing a deep, circular pit cut directly into the bedrock of the palace. Luke fell into the dark enclosure, landing on a layer of crushed bones and rusted metal armor. A massive metal gate lifted on one side of the pit, and a towering bipedal creature known as a rancor stepped out. The beast stood over 5 meters tall, possessing thick, grey skin, long, muscular arms, and a massive mouth filled with rows of jagged teeth. The rancor lunged forward, swinging its heavy arms at Luke. Luke dodged the strike, grabbing a large, thick bone from the floor of the pit. He jammed the bone entirely into the creature's mouth, propping its jaws open as it roared in pain. Luke rolled underneath the creature's legs and ran toward the open metal gate. He physically picked up a heavy skull and threw it directly at the control panel, mounted on the wall above the gate. The skull smashed the panel, shorting out the electrical circuits and sending the heavy Durasteel gate crashing straight down onto the rancor's thick neck, instantly killing the massive beast. Jabba stared down into the pit, his face contorted in anger. He ordered his guards to drag Luke, Han, and Chewbacca out of the palace and load them onto a large repulsor lift skiff. The skiff floated across the Dune Sea, navigating through the deep sand valleys toward the Great Pit of Carkoon. A massive, bowl-shaped depression in the sand housed the Sarlacc, a giant carnivorous creature completely buried in the desert floor. Thick, muscular tentacles extended outward from the center of the pit, surrounding a large, circular mouth lined with inward-facing teeth. The skiff hovered directly over the open maw of the creature. Luke stood at the edge of the metal plank extending from the side of the skiff. He looked up at R2-D2, who stood on the upper deck of Jabba's massive sail barge hovering nearby. R2-D2 opened a small compartment on his dome and physically launched Luke's metal lightsaber hilt into the air. Luke flipped backward off the plank, extending his hand. The metal cylinder landed perfectly in his palm. He ignited the green plasma blade and swung it horizontally, cutting through the iron chains binding his wrists. He landed firmly on the deck of the skiff, deflecting red blaster bolts from the guards with his lightsaber. Han, completely blind from the carbonite sickness, blindly swung a metal vibro-axe, striking the jetpack of Boba Fett. The physical impact triggered the rocket's ignition, launching the bounty hunter completely out of control. Fett crashed into the side of the sail barge and tumbled directly into the open mouth of the Sarlacc. Up on the sail barge, Leia grabbed the heavy iron chain connecting her metal collar to Jabba's dais. She wrapped the chain entirely around the Hutt's thick, muscular neck and pulled backward with all her physical strength. She held the chain tight until the crime lord completely stopped moving. Luke swung from a thick rope onto the deck of the sail barge, cutting through the guards with his green lightsaber. He aimed the heavy deck cannon directly at the main repulsor engines of the barge and fired. The resulting explosion ripped through the hull, sending pieces of burning metal crashing into the sand dunes. Luke, Leia, Han, and the droids grabbed hold of the rope and swung onto the smaller skiff, accelerating away from the burning wreckage as the massive sail barge collapsed into the Sarlacc pit. They returned to the Millennium Falcon and Luke's X-Wing, physically loading their gear and launching their ships away from Tatooine to rejoin the Rebel fleet, completely massing near Sullust. The Rebel fleet gathered in the dark space orbiting the volcanic planet of Sullust. Hundreds of ships maintained synchronized holding patterns, from massive Mon Calamari star cruisers with their blistered, bulbous hulls to small groups of X-Wing and Y-Wing fighters performing perimeter patrols. The Millennium Falcon docked inside the main hangar bay of the command cruiser Home 1. Han Solo, wearing a tan shirt and his heavy black vest, stood near the landing gear, discussing engine modifications with Chewbacca. Luke Skywalker walked into the main briefing room, wearing completely black garments and a dark cloak. Mon Mothma stood at the center of the room, alongside Admiral Akbar, a tall amphibious humanoid with mottled, salmon-colored skin and large, bulbous eyes protruding from the sides of his head. Akbar used a physical metal rod to point at the glowing blue hologram of the second Death Star displayed on the central table. Mothma stated clearly that the Emperor personally oversaw the final stages of the station's construction. Akbar explained that the station was currently protected by an invisible, impenetrable energy shield projected directly from the forest moon below. He pointed to the small, dish-shaped generator dish located in a densely wooded valley on the moon's surface. The rebel leadership detailed a dual assault strategy. A small, physical strike team needed to use a stolen Imperial shuttle to land on the moon, infiltrate the heavily guarded Imperial bunker, and manually deactivate the shield generator. Simultaneously, the entire rebel fleet would jump out of hyperspace, swarm the station, and fire proton torpedoes directly into the exposed main reactor before the Imperial forces could physically react. Han Solo stepped forward, volunteering to lead the ground assault team, and requested Chewbacca, Luke, and Leia to accompany him. Han loaded heavy explosive charges, repeating blaster rifles, and camouflage ponchos into the cargo hold of the stolen Imperial shuttle Tidarium. He sat in the pilot's seat, pulled the control yoke, and flew the shuttle away from the rebel fleet. He navigated the ship toward the Endor system, transmitting an older Imperial clearance code to the massive superstar destroyer Executor orbiting the Green Moon. The Imperial officers aboard the Star Destroyer received the transmission, verified the physical code cylinder sequence, and allowed the shuttle to pass through the orbital blockade. The Tidarium descended through the atmosphere, landing on a designated dirt platform surrounded by towering, centuries-old redwood trees. The strike team stepped off the shuttle ramp into the dense, humid forest. They wore specialized green and brown camouflage ponchos over their combat gear, attempting to blend with the thick undergrowth and massive tree trunks. They moved silently through the ferns, gripping their blaster rifles. They encountered a patrol of Imperial scout troopers riding fast repulsor lift speeder bikes through the trees. Luke and Leia chased the troopers on stolen bikes, physically dodging massive tree branches and firing laser blasts at the Imperial engines, completely destroying the patrol before they could transmit a warning back to the main bunker. During the chase, Leia became separated from the group and encountered a small, fur-covered biped designated an Ewok. The Ewoks guided the entire rebel team to their village, constructed entirely of wooden platforms and rope bridges suspended high within the thick branches of the redwood trees. That night, inside a large wooden hut, Luke spoke with Leia, revealing their shared physical lineage and acknowledging Darth Vader as their father. Luke left the hut, walking alone down the wooden ramps to the forest floor. He surrendered himself directly to an Imperial patrol, handing his metal lightsaber to an officer. An Imperial transport shuttle flew Luke up to the Death Star, where stormtroopers escorted him into the Emperor's throne room, located in a tall spire at the top of the station. Emperor Palpatine sat in a high-backed mechanical chair, turning slowly to face Luke. Darth Vader stood rigidly beside the Emperor. Palpatine pointed his wrinkled, pale finger toward the large circular viewport. He stated that the entire Rebel fleet was currently jumping out of hyperspace directly into a massive Imperial trap. Back on the surface of the moon, Han and Leia led the Rebel strike team toward the shield generator bunker. The Ewoks utilized physical guerrilla tactics against the Imperial garrison protecting the facility. They triggered heavy log traps, swinging massive wooden tree trunks directly into the sides of the AT-ST walkers, completely crushing the metallic cabins. Ewok warriors dropped from the high branches, physically attacking the stormtroopers with stone-tipped spears and wooden clubs. The chaotic battle scattered the Imperial forces, allowing Han to physically wire the heavy explosive charges to the main control consoles inside the bunker. He pressed the ignition switches, sprinting outside just as the charges detonated. The explosion completely shattered the reinforced bunker, instantly cutting the power supply and dropping the invisible energy shield protecting the massive battle station orbiting above. High above the forest moon, the rebel fleet emerged from hyperspace. Hundreds of physical star cruisers and fighter squadrons materialized in the dark space surrounding the Death Star, expecting the shield generator to be offline. However, the rebel command sensors registered the massive, invisible energy field still completely enveloping the station. Lando Calrissian sat in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon, physically gripping the control yoke and pulling the ship into a sharp, ascending turn to avoid crashing directly into the invisible shield. He yelled into the communication channel, ordering the entire rebel fleet to break off their attack run. Simultaneously, the physical trap formulated by Emperor Palpatine snapped shut. Dozens of Imperial Star Destroyers dropped out of hyperspace, completely encircling the rebel fleet and trapping them against the planetary shield. The Imperial cruisers launched thousands of TIE fighters and TIE interceptors from their lower hangars. The swarm of twin-engine ships dove toward the rebel cruisers, firing green plasma bolts into the heavy durasteel hulls. The rebel X-wings and A-wings engaged the Imperial fighters, their pilots pushing the throttles and firing red laser bursts in a chaotic, swirling dogfight above the atmosphere of the moon. Inside the Emperor's throne room on the Death Star, Palpatine watched the space battle through the massive circular viewport. He pointed his finger at the rebel cruisers and physically commanded his gunnery officers to fire the station's primary weapon. Deep within the station, the main hypermatter reactor surged, sending raw energy through the heavy power conduits. The 8 individual beams of green plasma ignited around the perimeter of the focusing dish, combining into a single, massive beam that shot out into space. The laser struck a rebel Mon Calamari cruiser, instantly penetrating its deflector shields and detonating the main reactors. The massive ship exploded in a blinding ball of white fire, sending large chunks of charred hull plating scattering through the Imperial blockade. Luke Skywalker watched the destruction of the rebel ship from the throne room. He stood near the large viewport, his hands bound by metal cuffs. He turned toward the Emperor, reached out with his physical hand, and pulled his confiscated lightsaber directly from the metal control console. He ignited the green blade and swung it downward toward Palpatine. Darth Vader stepped in front of the Emperor, igniting his red lightsaber and physically blocking the strike. The heavy impact of the 2 plasma blades sent sparks flying across the black, polished floor. Luke swung his lightsaber again, driving Vader backward down a flight of metal stairs and into the dimly lit lower levels of the throne room. Vader retreated into the shadows beneath the main platform, swinging his red blade to deflect Luke's continuous strikes. He probed Luke's mind, physically sensing the strong connection between Luke and Princess Leia. Vader stated out loud that if Luke would not turn to the dark side, perhaps his sister would. Hearing the physical threat against his sister, Luke yelled in anger and lunged forward, swinging his green lightsaber with immense, uncontrolled physical force. He battered Vader's defenses, driving the Sith Lord backward, until Vader tripped over the metal grating and collapsed onto the catwalk. Luke swung his blade down, physically severing Vader's mechanical right hand at the wrist. The mechanical hand, still holding the red lightsaber, tumbled over the edge of the catwalk and fell into the deep reactor shaft below. The Emperor stood up from his chair, a wide smile crinkling the deep lines on his pale face. He walked slowly down the stairs, ordering Luke to physically strike down his father and take his place at the Emperor's side. Luke looked down at Vader's sparking mechanical stump and then looked at his own black-gloved mechanical hand. He deactivated his green lightsaber, entirely powering down the blade, and threw the metal cylinder onto the floor. He stated clearly that he was a Jedi, just as his father had been before him. The Emperor raised his hands, completely dropping his polite facade. Bright blue arcs of physical lightning shot from his fingertips, striking Luke directly in the chest. The intense electrical discharge threw Luke backward against the metal railing, causing his body to spasm violently. Palpatine walked closer, firing continuous bursts of lightning into the young Jedi. Vader climbed slowly to his feet, leaning heavily against the railing. He watched the Emperor torturing his son, the blue lightning illuminating the black mask. Vader turned away from Luke, physically grabbing the Emperor around the waist with his remaining arm. He hoisted the older man entirely off the ground, lifting him high into the air. The Emperor fired blue lightning back into Vader, shorting out his mechanical life support systems and causing the respirator to spark and fail. Vader carried the Emperor to the edge of the catwalk and threw him directly down the massive reactor shaft. The Emperor fell into the dark abyss, and a massive physical shockwave of blue energy erupted upward from the core, blowing back the dark cowl of Vader's helmet as he collapsed onto the metal grating. Back on the forest moon, Han Solo rewired the heavy blast doors of the shield bunker, forcing them open. He placed the heavy explosive charges against the main power consoles and ran outside. The charges detonated, sending a massive fireball expanding outward through the thick metal roof. The physical destruction of the bunker immediately deactivated the deflector shield, projecting into space. Lando Calrissian saw the shield drop on his physical sensor readouts. He banked the Millennium Falcon sharply, leading a small group of X-Wings and A-Wings straight toward the Death Star. They flew low over the surface, diving directly into the exposed metallic infrastructure of the station, searching for the pathway to the main reactor core. Lando Calrissian pulled the control yoke of the Millennium Falcon sharply to the right, banking the heavy freighter around the curvature of the Death Star's massive superlaser dish. The saucer-shaped ship dove directly toward the station's equator, followed closely by two wedge-shaped Rebel X-Wing fighters. Ahead of them, a narrow rectangular opening gaped in the metal armor of the equatorial trench. The opening provided direct physical access into the station's internal superstructure. Lando pushed the throttle forward, and the Falcon shot into the dark tunnel, instantly surrounded by heavy durasteel beams, thick cooling pipes, and flashing warning lights. The X-Wings followed, their engines flaring bright red in the confined space. Behind them, 3 Imperial TIE interceptors entered the tunnel, firing green laser bursts that ricocheted off the metal walls and struck the heavy pipes, sending showers of sparks and steam into the flight path. The tunnel twisted and narrowed, forcing Lando to physically rotate the Falcon onto its side to maneuver the wide hull between the massive structural supports. One of the pursuing TI interceptors clipped its pointed solar panel against a protruding metal beam. The physical impact shattered the panel, sending the Imperial fighter spinning violently into the tunnel wall, where it exploded into a ball of orange fire. The Falcon continued its descent, following the heavy power conduits deeper into the station's core. The tunnel eventually opened into a massive cavernous chamber. At the center of the chamber stood the main hypermatter reactor, a towering cylindrical structure pulsating with intense blue electrical energy. Thick metal rings surrounded the core, feeding raw power up toward the station's primary weapon. Lando piloted the Falcon into the open space of the reactor room, flying in a tight circle around the central column. The two rebel X-wings broke formation, flying toward the thick metal rings. The pilot of the lead X-wing, Wedge Antilles, pressed the firing button on his control stick. Two proton torpedoes shot out from the fighter's nose, glowing pink as they struck the heavy power regulator mounted on the reactor's exterior casing. The physical explosion tore the regulator apart, exposing the volatile hypermatter energy inside the core. Lando aligned the Falcon's forward mandibles directly with the exposed breach. He fired a continuous barrage of red laser bolts from the quad cannons, followed by two concussion missiles from the forward launchers. The physical projectiles penetrated deep into the main reactor chamber, triggering an immediate, violent chain reaction within the hypermatter core. The blue energy of the reactor instantly turned a blinding, unstable red. Massive columns of fire erupted from the central column, physically melting the surrounding catwalks and thick metal support beams. Lando slammed the throttle to maximum, steering the Falcon back toward the exhaust tunnel as a wall of expanding flame rushed up the shaft directly behind them. The remaining Imperial TIE fighters were instantly incinerated by the superheated plasma. The Falcon raced up the twisting tunnel, the orange fire completely filling the narrow space just meters behind the ship's aft deflector shields. Lando gripped the yoke, his knuckles white, and physically wove the ship through the final narrowing gap, shooting out of the exterior trench and into the black vacuum of space, just as the expanding fireball breached the station's surface. The entire Death Star expanded rapidly outward. The thick durasteel armor plates bulged and fractured, tearing apart at the seams. The station exploded in a colossal, blinding sphere of white and yellow fire, instantly vaporizing the remaining Imperial personnel aboard and sending millions of tons of shattered metal scattering across the orbit of Endor. The massive explosion illuminated the surrounding space, casting bright flashes of light across the hulls of the surviving rebel cruisers. Down on the forest moon, Han, Leia, and the rebel ground troops stood in the dense fern undergrowth, looking up through the branches of the towering redwood trees. They watched the bright flash of the explosion spread across the daytime sky, confirming the physical destruction of the battle station. The Ewok warriors standing around them lowered their stone spears and raised their arms, letting out loud, trilling cheers that echoed through the forest. The surviving Imperial stormtroopers, scattered and broken by the Ewok assault, dropped their E-11 blasters onto the dirt and raised their hands in physical surrender to the rebel soldiers. Later that evening, the rebel forces gathered in the Ewok village, suspended high in the trees. Bright orange fires burned in raised metal braziers, illuminating the wooden platforms and thick, knotted ropes. Ewok musicians beat out rhythmic patterns on hollowed-out tree trunks and stretched animal hides. Rebel pilots, mechanics, and soldiers removed their heavy helmets and flight gear, sitting together on the wooden decking. They drank from rough wooden bowls and ate roasted meat prepared over the open flames. Han Solo stood near the edge of the platform, wearing his white shirt and black vest, holding Princess Leia tightly in his arms. Luke Skywalker stood a short distance away, wearing his dark cloak. He looked toward the edge of the clearing, observing the flickering, translucent blue forms of Yoda, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Anakin Skywalker standing together in the shadows of the trees. The physical destruction of the Emperor and the second Death Star had completely fractured the Imperial command structure, physically breaking their grip on the galaxy and leaving the Alliance to restore the Republic to celebrate their total victory amidst the sounds of drums and the light of the fires. The physical destruction of the Emperor and his fleet did not immediately end the fighting. Scattered Imperial commanders, cut off entirely from the central command structure, retained control of massive super-star destroyers, and heavily fortified planetary garrisons. Without Palpatine's centralized orders to dictate their physical troop movements, these regional governors, commonly referred to as warlords, essentially claimed massive territories for themselves. They ordered their stormtroopers to physically barricade the city streets and construct massive durasteel walls around their command centers, locking down individual planets and solar systems entirely through physical force and the threat of heavy orbital bombardment. Consequently, the Rebel Alliance, newly reformed as the New Republic, realized they needed to systematically track down and physically dismantle these remaining Imperial strongholds, one by one. Mon Mothma stood at the center of the New Republic Command Center on Chandrila, adjusting the heavy silk sleeves of her white chancellor robes. She looked down at a wide, glowing physical holomap projecting the entire galaxy. Small, red triangular icons dotted the map, indicating the confirmed physical locations of the remaining Imperial warlords. General Hera Syndulla pointed her green finger at an isolated cluster of red icons located in the Anuat sector. She physically dragged a blue marker across the screen, drawing a direct line from the New Republic fleet toward the Imperial holdouts. Mon Mothma nodded and authorized the deployment of the military forces. Rebel technicians loaded crates of heavy proton torpedoes and repeated blaster power packs onto the cargo ramps of the newly manufactured E-wing starfighters and heavy B-wing bombers. The pilots climbed the metal ladders, locked their harnesses, and ignited the sublight engines. The massive Mon Calamari cruisers blasted their repulsor thrusters, pushing the heavy, blistered hulls completely out of the atmosphere and into the dark space above Chandrila. The physical fleet engaged their hyperdrives, stretching the starlight into long white streaks as they traveled toward the Anuat sector to physically confront the entrenched Imperial forces. The Imperial governor Adelhard maintained control over the entire Anuat sector using a physical strategy known as the Iron Blockade. He positioned a ring of star destroyers and heavily armed defense platforms completely around the perimeter of the sector, physically preventing any civilian transports from entering or leaving the system. Inside the blockade, the Imperial forces continuously raided the local populations for food, fuel, and medical supplies, creating widespread starvation and physical suffering. The New Republic fleet dropped out of hyperspace just outside the blockade ring. The X-Wing and Y-Wing squadrons deployed from the hangar bays, physically diving through the gaps between the star destroyers. The rebel pilots fired their laser cannons directly at the Imperial defense platforms, targeting the physical fuel lines and communication arrays. The explosions ripped through the durasteel structures, showering the dark space with burning debris. Meanwhile, a small team of New Republic operatives landed a modified transport ship on the surface of Anuat City. They wore dark grey stealth suits and carried heavy explosive charges in canvas bags. They physically infiltrated the main Imperial communications tower, climbing the metal maintenance ladders and wiring the explosives directly to the primary power core. They detonated the charges, physically destroying the tower and severing Governor Adelhard's ability to communicate with his blockading fleet. The sudden loss of physical coordination caused the Imperial Star Destroyers to break formation, completely shattering the Iron Blockade and allowing the New Republic forces to enter the sector. A year after the Battle of Endor, the remaining Imperial forces gathered their surviving ships over the desert planet of Jakku. Grand Admiral Ray Sloan commanded the massive Super Star Destroyer Ravager, the physical centerpiece of the Imperial fleet. The Empire had constructed a secret weapons facility deep beneath the shifting sand dunes, intending to use the remote location to physically rebuild their lost military strength. The New Republic intercepted physical communications detailing the Imperial gathering at Jakku. Admiral Akbar stood on the bridge of his command cruiser, analyzing the tactical data displayed on the physical readouts. He ordered the entire New Republic fleet to jump to hyperspace, physically committing every available ship and soldier to entirely crush the final Imperial resistance. The New Republic fleet reverted from hyperspace above Jakku, instantly engaging the massive Imperial armada. Thousands of X-wings, TIE fighters, and heavy bombers clashed in the space above the planet. The sky filled entirely with thick bursts of red and green plasma, exploding starfighters, and the heavy physical impacts of capital ships colliding in the vacuum. Down on the surface of Jakku, New Republic ground troops landed in heavy transport skiffs. They ran across the hot, shifting sand dunes, firing their blaster rifles at the entrenched stormtroopers defending the secret Imperial facility. The battle in orbit raged fiercely. A group of New Republic X-wings concentrated their proton torpedoes specifically on the bridge deflector shields of the superstar destroyer Ravager. The physical impacts overloaded the shield generators, leaving the command tower completely exposed. A damaged New Republic corvette physically rammed its heavy hull directly into the bridge of the Ravager. The massive explosion tore through the command center, killing the Imperial officers and completely destroying the ship's navigation controls. The massive, wedge-shaped superstar destroyer, listed heavily to its side, pulled relentlessly by the planet's gravity. The ship plummeted through the atmosphere, its massive hull glowing red-hot from the physical friction of re-entry. It crashed violently into the desert floor, sending a massive shockwave of sand and pulverized metal rolling across the dunes. The destruction of the Ravager completely broke the physical resolve of the remaining Imperial forces, forcing them to surrender their weapons and officially ending the Galactic Civil War. The physical destruction of the Emperor and his fleet did not immediately end the fighting. Scattered Imperial commanders, cut off entirely from the central command structure, retained control of massive superstar destroyers and heavily fortified planetary garrisons. Without Palpatine's centralized orders to dictate their physical troop movements, these regional governors, commonly referred to as warlords, essentially claimed massive territories for themselves. They ordered their stormtroopers to physically barricade the city streets and construct massive durasteel walls around their command centers, locking down individual planets and solar systems entirely through physical force and the threat of heavy orbital bombardment. Consequently, the Rebel Alliance, newly reformed as the New Republic, realized they needed to systematically track down and physically dismantle these remaining Imperial strongholds, one by one. Mon Mothma stood at the center of the New Republic Command Center on Chandrila, adjusting the heavy silk sleeves of her white Chancellor robes. She looked down at a wide, glowing physical holomap projecting the entire galaxy. Small, red triangular icons dotted the map, indicating the confirmed physical locations of the remaining Imperial warlords. General Hera Syndulla pointed her green finger at an isolated cluster of red icons located in the Anoat sector. She physically dragged a blue marker across the screen, drawing a direct line from the New Republic fleet toward the Imperial holdouts. Mon Mothma nodded and authorized the deployment of the military forces. Rebel technicians loaded crates of heavy proton torpedoes and repeated blaster power packs onto the cargo ramps of the newly manufactured E-wing starfighters and heavy B-wing bombers. The pilots climbed the metal ladders, locked their harnesses, and ignited the sublight engines. The massive Mon Calamari cruisers blasted their repulsor thrusters, pushing the heavy, blistered hulls completely out of the atmosphere and into the dark space above Chandrila. The physical fleet engaged their hyperdrives, stretching the starlight into long white streaks as they traveled toward the Anoet sector to physically confront the entrenched Imperial forces. The Imperial Governor Adelhard maintained control over the entire Anoet sector, using a physical strategy known as the Iron Blockade. He positioned a ring of star destroyers and heavily armed defense platforms completely around the perimeter of the sector, physically preventing any civilian transports from entering or leaving the system. Inside the blockade, the Imperial forces continuously raided the local populations for food, fuel, and medical supplies, creating widespread starvation and physical suffering. The New Republic fleet dropped out of hyperspace just outside the blockade ring. The X-Wing and Y-Wing squadrons deployed from the hangar bays, physically diving through the gaps between the star destroyers. The rebel pilots fired their laser cannons directly at the Imperial defense platforms, targeting the physical fuel lines and communication arrays. The explosions ripped through the durasteel structures, showering the dark space with burning debris. Meanwhile, a small team of New Republic operatives landed a modified transport ship on the surface of Anoet City. They wore dark gray stealth suits and carried heavy explosive charges in canvas bags. They physically infiltrated the main Imperial communications tower, climbing the metal maintenance ladders and wiring the explosives directly to the primary power core. They detonated the charges, physically destroying the tower and severing Governor Adelhard's ability to communicate with his blockading fleet. The sudden loss of physical coordination caused the Imperial Star Destroyers to break formation, completely shattering the Iron Blockade and allowing the New Republic forces to enter the sector. A year after the Battle of Endor, the remaining Imperial forces gathered their surviving ships over the desert planet of Jakku. Grand Admiral Ray Sloan commanded the massive superstar destroyer Ravager, the physical centerpiece of the Imperial fleet. The Empire had constructed a secret weapons facility deep beneath the shifting sand dunes, intending to use the remote location to physically rebuild their lost military strength. The New Republic intercepted physical communications detailing the Imperial gathering at Jakku. Admiral Akbar stood on the bridge of his command cruiser, analyzing the tactical data displayed on the physical readouts. He ordered the entire New Republic fleet to jump to hyperspace, physically committing every available ship and soldier to entirely crush the final Imperial resistance. The New Republic fleet reverted from hyperspace above Jakku, instantly engaging the massive Imperial armada. Thousands of X-Wings, TIE fighters, and heavy bombers clashed in the space above the planet. The sky filled entirely with thick bursts of red and green plasma, exploding starfighters, and the heavy physical impacts of capital ships colliding in the vacuum. Down on the surface of Jakku, New Republic ground troops landed in heavy transport skiffs. They ran across the hot, shifting sand dunes, firing their blaster rifles at the entrenched stormtroopers defending the secret Imperial facility. The battle in orbit raged fiercely. A group of New Republic X-Wings concentrated their proton torpedoes specifically on the bridge deflector shields of the superstar destroyer Ravager. The physical impacts overloaded the shield generators, leaving the command tower completely exposed. A damaged New Republic corvette physically rammed its heavy hull directly into the bridge of the Ravager. The massive explosion tore through the command center, killing the Imperial officers and completely destroying the ship's navigation controls. The massive, wedge-shaped superstar destroyer, listed heavily to its side, pulled relentlessly by the planet's gravity. The ship plummeted through the atmosphere, its massive hull glowing red-hot from the physical friction of re-entry. It crashed violently into the desert floor, sending a massive shockwave of sand and pulverized metal rolling across the dunes. The destruction of the Ravager completely broke the physical resolve of the remaining Imperial forces, forcing them to surrender their weapons and officially ending the Galactic Civil War. The New Republic Senate convened on the planet Chandrila, a world of calm seas and rolling green hills. The senators sat in a wide, circular amphitheater, built from polished white stone and clear, transparent steel. They wore physical garments representing their homeworlds, from heavy wool robes to fine spun silks. Mon Mothma stood at the central podium, her voice amplified by the electronic vocoders mounted on the curved walls. She presented physical data pads containing thousands of reports of continued Imperial aggression across the Mid-Rim. The surviving Imperial commanders, entirely cut off from the Emperor's central command, had fractured into independent military factions. These commanders, known as Imperial warlords, retained physical control over massive superstar destroyers, legions of white-armored stormtroopers, and countless planetary supply chains. Mothma argued that the New Republic could not simply wait for these scattered forces to surrender. She requested authorization to continuously deploy the physical fleet, pushing the military campaign forward to physically dismantle the remaining Imperial infrastructure. The senators debated the physical cost of continued warfare. Many argued that their home systems required immediate physical rebuilding, not further military expenditure. They pointed to the massive craters, burned forests, and destroyed cities scattered across the galaxy. However, the physical evidence of Imperial atrocities committed by the warlords proved undeniable. Reports showed Imperial walkers crushing civilian agricultural centers and Star Destroyers physically blockading trade routes to starve entire populations. The Senate cast their physical votes, pushing the electronic buttons on their consoles. The green lights illuminated, confirming the authorization. Mon Mothma immediately transmitted the physical coordinates to the New Republic fleet commanders waiting in orbit. General Hera Syndulla commanded a massive strike force of Mon Calamari cruisers and X-Wing fighters. She stood on the bridge of her flagship, tracing a physical route across a glowing holomap. She targeted a specific cluster of red icons located in the Anoat sector. The Imperial Governor Adelhard maintained physical control over this territory through a strategy known as the Iron Blockade. He ordered his Star Destroyers to form a continuous physical ring around the sector, positioning the massive wedge-shaped ships closely together. The ships utilized interlocking deflector shields and overlapping turbo-laser firing arcs to completely prevent any physical transport or unencrypted communication signal from crossing the perimeter. Inside the blockade, Adelhard's forces seized physical control of all food and medical shipments, causing widespread starvation in the densely populated cities. The New Republic fleet dropped out of hyperspace directly on the edge of the Iron Blockade. The massive Mon Calamari cruisers immediately fired their heavy ion cannons, sending large bursts of blue energy directly at the Imperial Star Destroyers. The physical impact of the ion blasts overloaded the Imperial deflector shields, causing the energy fields to physically pop and completely drop away from the grey hulls. New Republic X-Wing and B-Wing starfighters launched from the hangar bays, diving physically between the massive Imperial ships. They fired proton torpedoes directly into the exposed shield generators and command towers of the Star Destroyers, blowing large chunks of burning durasteel into the vacuum of space. Simultaneously, a small team of New Republic operatives landed a heavily modified transport ship on the physical surface of Anoat City. They wore dark grey combat gear and carried heavy rucksacks packed entirely with explosive charges. They physically breached the main Imperial communications tower, shooting the stormtroopers guarding the entrance. The operatives climbed the metal maintenance ladders, ascending directly into the primary power core. They physically wired the explosive charges to the heavy cooling lines and the central databanks. They activated the timers and sprinted out of the tower. The charges detonated, sending a massive shockwave of fire and shattered concrete rolling across the city plaza. The physical destruction of the tower instantly severed Governor Adelhard's ability to communicate with his blockading fleet. The Imperial Star Destroyers, suddenly cut off from Central Command, broke their physical formation and attempted to retreat into hyperspace, completely shattering the Iron Blockade and allowing the New Republic forces to enter the sector. News of the blockade's destruction spread physically across the galaxy, entirely breaking the morale of the remaining Imperial factions. Over the next year, the New Republic fleet systematically engaged the scattered warlords, hunting their physical forces from system to system. New Republic troopers landed on volcanic planets and frozen moons, physically engaging stormtroopers in dense jungles and narrow urban corridors. They captured Imperial supply depots, seizing thousands of physical blaster rifles, medical kits, and crates of refined coaxium. The Imperial forces slowly retreated, pulling their physical fleets back from the core worlds and the mid-rim, massing their remaining ships in the desolate, unmapped regions of the galaxy. The physical destruction of the Imperial fleet at Jakku left the vast desert covered in miles of burning wreckage. Super Star Destroyers, TIE fighters, and heavy AT-AT walkers lay half-buried in the shifting sand dunes, thick black smoke rising from their shattered engines. Scavengers wrapped in heavy cloth masks and tinted goggles climbed over the scorched metal hulls, physically prying loose the intact power cells and unspooling the copper wiring with heavy iron tools. The New Republic forces established physical perimeter camps around the largest wreckages, erecting temporary fabric tents and metal supply crates. New Republic medics wearing bright orange jackets walked through the sand, carrying heavy canvas bags filled with Bacta patches and synthetic skin grafts to treat the surviving soldiers from both sides. Mon Mothma arrived on the surface of Jakku in a sleek, silver transport shuttle. She walked down the extended boarding ramp onto the hard-packed sand, accompanied by Chancellor Leia Organa and a detachment of heavily armed New Republic guards. They walked toward a large white canvas command tent erected near the remains of an Imperial command tower. Inside the tent, Grand Vizier Mas Ameda, the highest-ranking surviving Imperial official, sat at a simple metal folding table. He wore his heavy blue and gold robes, his physical posture rigid and tense. He stared at a physical flimsiplast document resting on the table in front of him. The document contained the specific terms of the Galactic Concordance. Mon Mothma stood across the table from Ameda, physically placing a heavy metal ink pen next to the document. The terms required the complete physical demilitarization of the remaining Imperial forces. The Imperial military had to immediately dismantle their heavy weapons factories, physically scuttle their surviving Star Destroyers, and confine their operations entirely to a small, specific sector of the core worlds, heavily monitored by New Republic sensor grids. Ameda picked up the heavy metal pen, his hands shaking slightly as he pressed the nib against the flimsiplast. He signed his name at the bottom of the page, physically surrendering the Galactic Empire to the New Republic and officially ending the Galactic Civil War. The New Republic couriers immediately transmitted physical copies of the signed concordance across the holonet, utilizing the deep space relay satellites to broadcast the terms to every inhabited system. Imperial commanders stationed on distant outer rim planets received the physical datapads, reading the surrender orders authorized directly by Mas Ameda. Many of these commanders physically slammed their fists onto their control consoles, furious at the capitulation. They refused to dismantle their heavy repeating blasters or power down their planetary deflector shields. However, the physical reality of their isolated positions quickly broke their resolve. Without centralized supply lines to provide raw coaxium fuel, heavy artillery shells, and fresh stormtrooper recruits, the regional Imperial garrisons began to physically crumble. On the heavily industrialized world of Kuat, Imperial officers ordered their stormtroopers to physically lock the massive blast doors of the primary shipyards. The workers inside the factories, hearing the broadcast of the Imperial surrender, dropped their hydro-spanners and heavy welding torches onto the metal grating. They picked up heavy iron pipes and physical construction tools, marching directly toward the command offices. The stormtroopers fired their E-11 blasters into the crowd, but the sheer physical mass of the workers pushed them backward. The workers physically breached the command center, dragging the Imperial officers out into the open assembly yards and lowering the heavy Imperial banners from the walls. The New Republic fleet physically moved into the core worlds, their massive Mon Calamari cruisers arriving in orbit above Coruscant, Corellia, and Hosnian Prime. The physical presence of the heavy star cruisers forced the remaining Imperial blockades to stand down. New Republic transports landed in the city plazas, unloading physical crates of medical supplies and food rations for the starved populations. The citizens gathered around the transports, reaching out to physically take the sealed ration packs. The long physical war had ended, leaving the galaxy to rebuild from the physical scars of the conflict. The New Republic Senate began holding their physical sessions on Hosnian Prime, replacing the centralized authoritarian structure of the Empire with a rotating system of planetary governance. The physical remnants of the Galactic Civil War, the rusted walkers and the buried star destroyers, remained scattered across the galaxy, serving as physical testaments to the immense physical cost of the long struggle. The signing of the Galactic Concordance physically stripped the remaining Imperial forces of their weapons, starships, and occupied territories. New Republic soldiers walked through the dense streets of Coruscant, pulling down the heavy, hexagonal Imperial banners and tossing the thick fabric into large repulsor lift disposal bins. The stormtroopers who had survived the Battle of Jakku stood in long, silent lines on the desert surface, physically unlatching the armor plates from their chests and dropping their white helmets into the sand. The New Republic established specialized processing camps, converting the massive Imperial hangar bays into civilian administrative centers. Inside these centers, technicians unspooled miles of data wire, connecting physical holoterminals to the planetary communication grids to register the surrendering Imperial officers. A small, isolated faction of Imperial hardliners refused to sign the concordance. These commanders gathered their remaining star destroyers and physically retreated into the unknown regions, a vast area of completely uncharted space filled with dense nebulae and volatile gravity wells. They erased their physical navigation logs and completely destroyed their long-range communication arrays, preventing the New Republic from tracking their flight paths. They flew their massive warships into the dark, uncharted void, carrying thousands of loyalist troops, scientists, and heavy weapons schematics. They established hidden bases on remote, rocky planets, completely hidden from the rest of the galaxy, laying the physical groundwork for a new military organization that would eventually emerge decades later. Meanwhile, Luke Skywalker walked away from the New Republic command centers, packing his physical belongings into the small cargo hold of his X-Wing starfighter. He wore a simple beige tunic and carried a long canvas wrap containing ancient, leather-bound books. He flew his starfighter to remote, uninhabited worlds, physically searching the ruins of old Jedi temples. He dug through the dirt and the collapsed stone walls, pulling small, crystal-powered holocrons and physical lightsaber components from the rubble. He gathered these physical artifacts, intending to establish a completely new training facility to rebuild the Jedi Order. Han Solo and Chewbacca returned to the Millennium Falcon, physically repairing the damaged hyperdrive engine and replacing the scorched armor plating on the exterior hull. They flew the freighter back to the core worlds, accepting physical contracts from the New Republic to transport medical supplies and building materials to the planets most heavily damaged during the war. Princess Leia Organa remained on Chandrila, sitting in the vast Senate chamber. She wore heavy, formal robes and stood behind a physical podium, arguing with the other senators about the massive financial costs associated with completely demilitarizing the galaxy. She pointed to physical ledgers and supply manifests, pushing the assembly to establish a small, dedicated defense force to protect the newly formed republic from the remaining criminal syndicates and the pirates operating in the Outer Rim. On the forest moon of Endor, the Ewoks physically dismantled the heavy Imperial bunkers. They used the large, flat durasteel plates to reinforce the wooden platforms of their village. They strung the thick black power cables between the massive redwood trees, creating new bridges and climbing ropes. The physical debris of the galactic civil war became completely integrated into the natural environment. Vines and thick moss grew rapidly over the rusted chassis of the AT-ST walkers, left abandoned in the dense fern undergrowth. The burnt, scorched craters caused by the exploding starfighters slowly filled with rainwater, creating small pools surrounded by new, green vegetation. The physical scars of the conflict faded into the landscape, completely swallowed by the ancient forest. The galactic civil war physically reshaped the entire structure of the galaxy. The massive, centralized military factories of the Empire shut down completely, their assembly lines grinding to a physical halt. The large Imperial academies, previously filled with thousands of cadets in identical grey uniforms, stood completely empty, their heavy iron gates padlocked shut. The New Republic decentralized the physical command structures, allowing individual planets to establish their own local militias and physically control their own planetary defense grids. The citizens of the galaxy walked through the city plazas without the constant physical presence of white-armored stormtroopers patrolling the streets. They gathered in the cantinas and the marketplaces, speaking openly without fear of Imperial listening devices or physical reprisals. The long, destructive conflict had finally reached its physical conclusion, replacing the heavy durasteel fist of the Empire with the fragile, physical reality of a newly established peace. The New Republic Senate immediately ordered the widespread physical destruction of all captured Imperial military assets following the signing of the Galactic Concordance. Demolition crews landed on former Imperial worlds, carrying heavy plasma cutters and focused laser saws. They walked into the massive vehicle depots, physically slicing the thick metal legs off the AT-AT walkers and cutting the durasteel command cabins into small transportable rectangles. The workers loaded the heavy metal scrap onto repulsor lift barges, flying the destroyed armor plating to massive, planet-wide smelting facilities. Inside the smelters, giant industrial furnaces burned at extreme temperatures, melting the grey Imperial metal down into liquid slag. The factories then poured the molten steel into new physical molds, completely repurposing the weapons of war into civilian transport vehicles, agricultural droids, and structural support beams for new medical centers. The New Republic deliberately reduced its own physical military footprint to establish a stark visual contrast with the fallen empire. Mon Mothma stood before the Senate on Chandrila and presented physical data slabs outlining the Military Disarmament Act. She instructed the fleet commanders to dock the majority of the heavy Mon Calamari star cruisers in deep space dry docks. Mechanics powered down the massive hypermatter reactors, physically disconnecting the main fuel lines and draining the heavy liquid coaxium from the storage tanks. They unbolted the heavy turbo laser cannons from the exterior hulls, leaving the large starships completely stripped of their physical offensive capabilities. The New Republic retained only a fraction of its former fighting force, utilizing a small number of physical X-Wing and A-Wing squadrons to patrol the core worlds and maintain a basic physical defense grid. However, a small percentage of Imperial loyalists actively rejected the physical surrender and completely refused to dismantle their weapons. These remaining officers, politicians, and fleet admirals boarded their surviving star destroyers. They ordered their navigation officers to plot physical jump coordinates into the unknown regions, a vast, unexplored quadrant of the galaxy entirely blocked by massive physical anomalies, including dense nebulae and volatile gravity storms. The star destroyers fired their sublight engines, physically pushing their wedge-shaped hulls past the outer rim and disappearing into the dense, swirling gas clouds. Once inside the unknown regions, these Imperial remnants landed their ships on harsh, completely isolated worlds covered in thick ice and jagged obsidian rock formations. They physically offloaded heavy crates of survival gear, portable power generators, and classified weapons schematics. The stormtroopers physically carved deep, expansive tunnels into the rock walls, constructing hidden subterranean bases entirely shielded from New Republic sensor scans. They set up heavy manufacturing lines inside the caverns, using the raw ore extracted from the planets to physically stamp out new armor plating and blaster components. This isolated group, operating entirely in secret, began the slow, physical process of rebuilding their military strength. They designated themselves the First Order, laying the physical groundwork for a new, highly militarized regime that would remain completely hidden in the darkness for the next 3 decades. Meanwhile, Luke Skywalker walked alone across the rocky surface of the planet Ossus. He wore a simple beige tunic and carried a heavy canvas satchel slung over his shoulder. He physically explored the ancient, ruined stone structures of an abandoned Jedi temple. The thick stone pillars lay completely shattered across the ground, covered entirely in green moss and crawling vines. Luke dug his bare hands into the loose dirt, pulling out physical artifacts buried centuries ago. He found small, metal-bound books filled with ancient text and small, crystalline data storage devices known as holocrons. He wiped the dirt from a silver lightsaber emitter, examining the physical construction of the weapon. He collected these tangible pieces of Jedi history, packing them carefully into his satchel. He intended to use these physical items to construct a new Jedi Academy, physically training a new generation of students to understand and wield the Force. On the heavily forested moon of Endor, the small Ewok warriors walked through the dense undergrowth, physically scavenging the remaining Imperial debris. They found a destroyed AT-ST walker lying on its side in the mud, its metal cabin completely crushed by a heavy wooden log. The Ewoks used sharp stone axes to pry the flat durasteel plates off the walker's legs. They carried the heavy metal squares up the wooden ramps into their village, physically tying the plates over the gaps in their wooden platforms to reinforce the structures. They unspooled thick lengths of black insulated power cable from the destroyed Imperial bunker, using the strong wire to construct new physical bridges between the towering redwood trees. The metal remnants of the Imperial army slowly rusted in the damp, humid air, physically blending into the natural environment and becoming a permanent, structural part of the ancient forest. The New Republic Senate relocated its physical operations to the planet Hosnian Prime. The capital city consisted of tall metallic spires and wide circular glass domes resting on green agricultural plains. Inside the primary assembly hall, thousands of senators sat in floating repulsor pods. They wore heavily embroidered silk robes and dark wool tunics. Mon Mothma stood at the central podium, pressing her fingers against a glowing blue holoterminal. She presented physical datapads detailing the complete decommissioning of the heavy military fleets. The senators pushed the blue physical buttons on their armrests, casting their votes to approve the reallocation of military funds to civilian infrastructure. Consequently, mechanics working in the orbital dry docks physically unbolted the heavy turbo-laser batteries from the Mon Calamari cruisers. They drained the volatile hypermatter fluid from the main reactors and locked the massive starships into stationary holding clamps. Down on the surface of Coruscant, civilian workers wore thick yellow coveralls and heavy protective goggles. They climbed tall scaffolding erected against the sides of the massive government towers. The workers ignited heavy plasma torches, applying the bright blue flames directly to the thick Durasteel bolts holding the Imperial crests to the stone facades. The intense heat melted the metal, sending showers of yellow sparks falling down to the pedestrian walkways below. The heavy hexagonal Imperial cogs detached from the buildings and crashed heavily onto the permacrete plazas, shattering the pavement. Repulsor lift cargo skiffs collected the broken metal symbols and transported them directly to the planetary smelting facilities. Inside the foundries, automated loader droids dumped the Imperial debris into massive vats of liquid slag. The automated foundry machinery poured the molten Durasteel into new physical molds, creating structural support beams for new medical centers and outer casing panels for civilian transport shuttles. Luke Skywalker traveled to a remote, rain-swept island on the ocean planet of Ahto. The green island featured high, jagged cliffs that dropped sharply into the dark blue water. He wore a heavy woven cloak to block the constant wind and the driving rain. He knelt on the wet grass, physically lifting heavy, smooth river stones and stacking them in interlocking circles to construct small, dome-shaped huts. A small group of young students gathered on the rocky cliffs overlooking the ocean. Luke handed them cylindrical wooden training staffs. The students stood in wide stances, swinging the heavy wooden rods in practiced, repeating arcs. The loud clack of wood striking wood echoed over the sound of the crashing waves. Luke walked between the students, physically adjusting the angle of their shoulders and the placement of their feet on the slick rocks. He instructed them to close their eyes and feel the physical spray of the ocean water against their skin, guiding them to connect with the physical environment through the Force. Deep within the uncharted sectors of the unknown regions, the surviving Imperial hardliners continued their physical operations on barren, frozen planets. The dark space surrounding these worlds contained volatile gravity wells and dense, heavily ionized gas clouds. Imperial officers wearing crisp black uniforms marched across the metal grating of subterranean command centers. They directed heavy automated mining lasers to drill directly into the frozen crusts of the ice planets. The lasers extracted raw iron and heavy dunium ore from the deep mantle. Inside the massive underground factories, heavy hydraulic presses slammed downward with immense physical force, stamping the extracted metal into thick, white armor plates and angular durasteel vehicle chassis. Sparks flew from the assembly lines as automated welding arms fused the metal joints together. Technicians assembled new models of star destroyers in secret orbital shipyards, welding thick armor plating over the primary reactors and physically installing advanced deflector shield generators. Across the Outer Rim territories, independent smugglers and civilian merchants navigated the established hyperspace trade routes. They flew modified Corellian freighters and heavy cargo haulers between the remote star systems. The pilots sat in their cockpits, looking through the transparisteel viewports at the clear, unobstructed space ahead of them. They transmitted standard docking codes to the planetary control towers and landed their ships on the dirt runways. The merchants lowered their cargo ramps and physically unloaded crates of fresh agricultural produce, purified water tanks, and mechanical replacement parts. Local citizens walked through the open marketplaces, exchanging physical credit chips for the delivered goods. The merchants loaded their holds with mined minerals and harvested spices, securely locking the heavy blast doors of their freighters. The physical remnants of the galactic civil war remained embedded in the landscapes of countless worlds. Corroded stormtrooper helmets lay half-buried in the shifting white sands of Tatooine, filled entirely with loose dirt and small desert insects. The charred skeletal frames of heavy Imperial walkers rusted in the humid jungles of Endor, completely covered by thick layers of green moss and climbing vines. The massive, shattered sections of the Death Star drifted endlessly through the dark vacuum of space, entirely frozen and silent. The citizens of the newly formed Republic walked across the rebuilt stone plazas and worked inside the brightly lit agricultural processing centers. They physically built new homes, constructed new transport vessels, and harvested new crops from the cleared fields, preparing the physical foundation of the galaxy for the years to follow.